Уважаемые дамы и господа, мы начинаем пресс-конференцию министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации Сергея Викторовича Лаврова. Предоставлен перевод синхронный на английский, французский, испанский языки. Затем текстовая версия будет переведена и на дополнительные языки. Вначале вступительное слово, и затем вам будет предоставлена возможность задать вопросы. Пожалуйста, Сергей Викторович.
Спасибо большое, уважаемые дамы и господа. Рад вас приветствовать на нашей традиционной встрече, которая ежегодно проводится сразу после новогодних рождественских каникул. Поздравляю всех, кто отмечает эти праздники, с наступлением 2024 года, который мы все хотим сделать лучше во всех смыслах. И об этом подробно говорил наш президент. Наши планы на направлении внутреннего развития очень четко очерчены. Правительство работает активно. Буквально на днях состоялось несколько встреч президента с членами правительства по самым разным направлениям обеспечения устойчивого движения нашей экономики в тех условиях, которые сегодня сложились из-за агрессивной противоправной политики Соединенных Штатов и их сателлитов. Задачи стоят ясные: избавиться от какой-либо необходимости зависеть от тех производственно-бытовых, финансовых, банковских, логистических цепочек, которые так или иначе контролируются или находятся под большим влиянием наших западных коллег. И этот курс очень четко определен в решениях, которые приняты и которые будут приниматься. Точно так же я хочу вам сказать, что и на внешнеполитическом фронте мы определили свои основные направления на обозримую перспективу. Президент в марте утвердил концепцию внешней политики Российской Федерации в ее новой редакции, существенно, я бы сказал, даже кардинально пересмотренной, исходя из реалий современного мира, когда Запад доказал свою полную недоговороспособность, ненадежность как партнеров в любых начинаниях, и когда мировое большинство не хочет мириться с таким эгоистическим подходом и желает развиваться в полном соответствии со своими национальными интересами, с национальными интересами каждой страны и при полном уважении принципов Устава ООН, начиная с принципа уважения суверенного равенства государств. С момента принятия устава в 1945 году ни одно внешнеполитическое действие Запада на международной арене не учитывало и не уважало этот принцип равноправия всех государств, как сказано в уставе, больших и малых, независимо от того, какие они исповедуют ценности, какие они исповедуют религии и в целом какие традиции у них существуют. Поэтому на внешнеполитическом фронте у нас очень четко определены ориентиры на развитие отношений с теми, кто готов это делать на равноправной, взаимовыгодной, взаимоуважительной основе, через откровенный диалог, переговоры, нацеленные на поиск баланса интересов, а не каких-то решений, которые будут отвечать исключительно чьим-то односторонним эгоистичным планам, как это в подавляющем большинстве случаев проявляется в тех дискуссиях, в которых участвует Запад во главе с Соединенными Штатами. Ну и год минувший, конечно же, показал неприятие таких манер, традиционных для западного гегемона, которые полностью опираются на свой корыстный интерес и не учитывают интересы всех остальных. Да, 500 лет править всем миром, не иметь практически на протяжении почти всего этого периода, за исключением, может быть, советского периода, не иметь себе каких-то серьезных конкурентов, да, это, наверное, способствует привыканию к роли гегемона. Но жизнь, она все-таки движется вперед, появляются и уже окрепли новые центры экономического роста, финансовой мощи, политического влияния, центры, которые существенно опережают по своему развитию те же Соединенные Штаты и другие западные страны. Я уверен, что вы знаете о наших оценках развития отношений с Китайской Народной Республикой. Это наиболее быстро растущая экономика наряду с индийской экономикой. Отношения с Китаем переживают наилучший период в многовековой их истории. Для нас особенно ценно, что в свой первый государственный визит после переизбрания на пост председателя КНР Си Цзиньпин нанес в марте 2023 года в Москву, и в свою очередь президент Путин в октябре тоже прошлого года посетил Китай для участия в третьем международном форуме «Один пояс и один путь». Поступательно продвигаются отношения особо привилегированного стратегического партнерства с Индией. Здесь тоже регулярный диалог на высшем уровне, контакты между отраслевыми ведомствами по линии внешнеполитических министерств. Ну и если мы говорим о нашем
important step in development of our relations with the Latin American continent was the Interparliamentary Conference between Russia and Latin America that was held in autumn 2023. Both Africa and Latin America, just like the above-mentioned Asian countries, are emerging independent centers of the multipolar world. We have been actively working at the United Nations. The group of friends in defense of the UN Charter was established a few years ago and is working successfully. This group adopts joint statements on the principal matters related to global development. This group is actively galvanizing the United Nations General Assembly by promoting joint initiatives, including Russia's initiatives. And we likewise support the initiatives proposed by our partners in this group of friends. I would also like to highlight another important event, the fact that the UNGA passed another resolution on inadmissibility of glorification of Nazism, something that has become a regular occurrence. Despite the West's machinations, it was adopted by a landslide, and I would like to point out that for the second time in a row, Germany, Italy, and Japan voted against this document. The Axis countries that back in the day, after being defeated in the Second World War, publicly expressed their repentance for the crimes committed during the Second World War. Back in the day, they were assuring everyone that such crimes would not be repeated. However, in recent years, we see these countries voting against this resolution, demanding that Nazism not be revived. And it makes one wonder in what direction the ideological processes, both in these three countries and in the West in general, are developing. We have been constructively engaged in other formats as well. Here I would like to mention our closest allies. I am talking about the Union State of Russia and Belarus, as well as the Collective Security Treaty Organization. As part of the CSTO activities, we have been promoting ensuring stability in all of its dimensions, including its military aspect,
биологическую
as well as
и в целом
biological
защиту от новых
security
вызовов и
and
угроз, таких как
security
терроризм,
in terms of new
наркотрафик
challenges and threats, including
и
terrorism, drug
другие
trafficking,
виды
and other
организованной преступности. В
kinds of
Евразийском
organized
экономическом
crimes.
союзе
The
были
Eurasian
приняты
Economic
также
Union is
важные
also worthy of
решения,
mention.
нацеленные на
It has
углубление
passed certain
евразийской интеграции,
decisions about
на
deepening Eurasian
сопряжение этих
integration,
процессов
as well as
и
ensuring
с
cohesion
такими
of these
проектами, как
processes
«Один пояс,
with
один
the
путь»
Belt and Road
Китайской Народной
Initiative,
Республики, взаимодействие с
promoted
Шанхайской
by China.
организацией
The
сотрудничества
EAEU
с
is
АСЕАН
cooperating with
и
the
со всеми
Shanghai
другими
Cooperation Organization, with
структурами и
ASEAN,
странами, которые
and other
расположены на нашем общем
associations
огромном
and countries
евразийском
located on our
континенте.
common
Россия была
Eurasian
председателем
continent.
в Содружестве
Russia
независимых
chaired
государств,
the Commonwealth of
вернее,
Independent
стала
States,
председателем в этом году,
CIS.
и мы
Correction, Russia has
имеем
become
в виду
chairman
продолжать
of the
те
CIS, and
полезные
we
проекты,
intend
которые
to
стартовали
continue
в
the
году
useful
предыдущем,
projects that
в том числе,
started
конечно
last
же,
year.
будем уделять особое
For
внимание
example, we are going to pay
учрежденной
particular
на
attention
саммите в
to
Бишкеке осенью прошлого
the
года
fact that in
Международной
Bishkek in autumn
организации по
last
русскому
year, an
языку. Эта
international
инициатива
organization for the
Казахстана, она
Russian
была
language
одобрена
was
всеми членами
established.
Содружества,
This
но
initiative was
организация,
proposed by
которая
Kazakhstan
была
and
учреждена,
received
открыта
support
для
by
участия
all members of the
любого
Commonwealth. This
государства мира,
organization
и
is
мы знаем,
open
что
for
русский
participation to
язык
all
популярен
countries of the
на
world.
всех
We know that
континентах,
the Russian
рассчитываем, что
language is
в этой
popular
организации будет
everywhere
много
in the world, on
заинтересованных
all continents, and we are
участников.
hoping
Я
that there
упомянул
will be
Шанхайскую
a
организацию
lot of
сотрудничества
members
как
interested in the
такой
participation.
зонтичный проект,
I have mentioned the Shanghai
в рамках
Cooperation
которого наряду с
Organization as an
Евразийским
umbrella
экономическим
project.
союзом и
Together with
в
the
в
EAEU,
контексте взаимодействия с АСЕАН и с другими
ASEAN, and
субрегиональными
other
структурами,
sub-regional
мы
structures,
способствуем объективному,
we are trying to
естественному
ensure
формированию большого
an
евразийского
objective
партнерства, о чем
and natural
президент Путин
formation of a
говорил
greater Eurasian
еще на первом
partnership,
саммите
something President
России-АСЕАН,
Putin spoke
и
about at the
очертания
first
такого партнерства
Russia-ASEAN
уже
summit.
видны.
And we can
Важно в
already
нынешних
see the
условиях, чтобы
contours of this emerging
экономическое
partnership.
партнерство,
In
которое
this context, it's essential
отвечает
to make
интересам
sure
всех
that an
стран
economic partnership
нашего
serving
общего
the interests
континента,
of all countries on
сам
our
Бог велел
shared
нам
continent
использовать вот эти
is
объективные
developed.
конкурентные
It would be
преимущества расположения
wrong to
на
miss
одном пространстве,
out
причем
on the
пространстве,
advantages of existing
которое
on this shared
является
space,
локомотивом
this
роста
shared
мировой
continent,
экономики уже долгое
especially given
время
that this
и на
continent
долгие годы
has been a
будет
driving
эту роль
force in the
сохранять,
growth of
но
global
помимо
economy for many years
взаимных
and will
экономических,
remain one for many
взаимовыгодных
years to
экономических
come.
проектов, конечно,
Besides
важно
mutually beneficial economic
обеспечивать
projects,
на
we
этой
also
основе,
need
независимо
to
от других факторов, военно-политическую
ensure
безопасность в
military
Евразии.
and
Будем
political
выступать за то,
security in
чтобы
Eurasia.
эта
We are
задача
going
решалась
to
странами
make sure that
континента
this task is
без
resolved by
попыток
countries of the
внерегиональных
continent
государств
without any attempts from out-of-region
внедряться в
countries
эти процессы,
to
так сказать, со
insert themselves
своим
into
уставом.
these
Мы
processes,
убеждены, что
bringing
страны
their own
Евразии вполне в состоянии справиться со всем этим
ideas and
самостоятельно.
dictating their
Ну и,
will
конечно, я
to
перечислил
others. Eurasia is more than
различные
capable to
региональные
ensure its
структуры, но
security
есть и
itself.
надрегиональные структуры, глобальные
I've spoken
структуры, она
about
называется
regional structures, but there are
БРИКС
region,
символизирует
also
собой
global structures such as BRICS,
богатство
which
многополярного
is
мира,
a symbol of the richness of the multipolar world.
особо значимым шагом по укреплению позиции БРИКС
And
стало решение
right now,
прошлогоднего саммита в ЮАР
last
о
year's
расширении
South Africa summit
числа
took a
участников этого
decision to
объединения.
extend
И
the
Россия,
BRICS
которая с
membership,
1
which
января
became a
вступила в
very
права
important
председателя БРИКС,
step.
будет,
Starting
конечно, особое
from
внимание
the
уделять
1st of
тому,
February,
чтобы
Russia takes up the
новички,
baton in
новобранцы
BRICS, and will do everything in our power to make sure that the
вписались в нашу общую
newcomers
работу
fit
и тем
perfectly
самым
into our
способствовали
common
укреплению
agenda,
позитивных
thereby
тенденций не только
contributing
внутри
to
БРИКС как
strengthening positive
таковой,
trends not
но
just
и
within
на
BRICS
международной арене в интересах
itself, but
мирового
also in
большинства.
the
Если
international
учесть,
arena in general, in the
что
interest of the world
более
majority.
20
Given the
и даже
fact
ближе к
that
30
more than
стран
20
заинтересованы
countries,
в
almost 30
сближении с
countries
БРИКС,
are
то
interested
у
in
этого
getting closer together with
объединения с
BRICS.
глобальным
Given
составом
that,
участников,
this
конечно,
association with the
мы
global
видим
membership
очень большое
in
будущее.
our eyes
Скажу также о
has a
том,
bright
что
future ahead of it.
мы
I would also like to
по-прежнему
add
отдавали
that
приоритет
just as we did
защите законных
previously,
интересов,
we
законных прав российских
give
граждан за
priority to
рубежом,
protecting
то, как
legitimate
они
rights of
подвергаются
Russian citizens abroad,
дискриминации
the fact that they are facing discrimination in the countries of the collective West. This is a fact well known to you. Many of you are writing about that, unlike your Western counterparts who are increasingly often trying to hide the truth about how journalists feel in the countries of well-established democracy, pardon the expression. But apart from the everyday problems that our citizens are facing in the US and in Europe, as well as in other countries, certainly ever present are emergencies of natural origin as well as man-made disasters. So recently, we have been assisting in the evacuation of Russian citizens as well as the CIS countries and some other countries from the Gaza Strip, and some months before that, we helped with the evacuation from Sudan, where a conflict had broken out. As far as public diplomacy is concerned, I would like to point out such a milestone as the establishment of the International Russophile Movement last year. This is an informal association of people who live across different continents and yet feel some kind of spiritual proximity with Russia. The inauguration of the movement took place, and the first Congress is scheduled to take place in the first half of 2024. We're most certainly going to promote the ideals of truth and justice in international affairs. We shall spare no efforts to render international relations more democratic. And in that sense, the Russian Foreign Ministry is actively supporting the United Russia initiative of hosting an international inter-party forum of advocates of the fight against the modern practices of neocolonialism. The plans are to host that event in Moscow. The neocolonial nature and essence of the West's policy is pronounced in the current policies pursued by the US and its allies, and the essence is basically the same as it used to be, namely to use to their own advantage the resources coming from other countries. In other words, basically living at the expense of other countries. The forthcoming forum promises to be very interesting. It promises to be an important event. As far as the cultural agenda is concerned, Russia is preparing to host a number of high-profile events, such as the International Youth Festival, as you know, but little time is left before its opening. Also the Games of the Future, integrating physical sport and also cyber sport, the BRICS Games in Kazan in February, and in summer these events are going to take place. The International Intervision Singing Competition is also going to be held, and it is going to be attended by representatives of the world majority, and we will do everything in our power to make sure that the guests of ours who come to these events and to other events enjoy and take advantage of the Russian hospitality, just as it was the case in 2018 when Russia hosted the World Cup finals. And in conclusion, I would like to reaffirm our openness to communicating with the media in various formats. The representatives of the ministry present here, I believe, cannot be reproached for avoiding contact with journalists and other heads of departments and other high dignitaries of the ministry. When they go to international events or when they're here, they're not just trying, they also have it as their duty to speak and tell you about our job. They have the duty to make sure that our activities are well understood and are open. Thank you. And now we're ready to pass to Q&A session. Ria Novosti, please. If you'll allow me, Minister, two questions. First question, Minister. In case Ukraine holds elections this year, is it possible that a person comes to power there who is willing to talk to Russia? And how vital is it from Russia's point of view, how central is the agreement between Ukraine and Great Britain has been concluded, and also what do you think about the probability of conclusion of similar agreements with other countries, like the G7 countries? Honestly, we are not that concerned with the hiccups that come up in the political life of Ukraine. Yes, the issue of elections has come up. We have heard that the West is insisting that Zelensky should hold such elections, probably supposing that the electoral campaign and the vote itself would probably allow them to steer Zelensky closer to the West's interests, because very often he's deviating from those interests right now. He's often saying that elections are not going to take place because the war is raging on. But it seems as if all of that had been orchestrated. It's as if this person and his accomplices are doing everything in our power to cling on to power. And I see this desire of his to cling on to power. The West wants greater flexibility, because the West has already understood that the blitzkrieg that was so much promoted and advertised with a view to dealing a strategic defeat to Russia had failed. And the paradigm has shifted, especially within the minds of the West. The West has realized its mistake, even though it's difficult for them to admit that. So they're trying to send some external signals right now. On the one hand, these signals allow them to continue supporting Ukraine. On the other hand, it allows them to continue pushing Kyiv to be more pliable and more obedient to its Western masters. How this is going to play out, I don't know. And you had a second question. The second question was about the agreement between Kyiv and London, the security agreement. How does it fit into the future settlement? Well, this is not something new. Some years ago, when there were clashes about admitting Ukraine into NATO, the EU, and some other countries, they were not that happy. Not everyone was happy, and they understood, some of them, that it would be yet another irresponsible, risky step from the point of view of European security. So it's just kind of a half-baked product, namely this idea of concluding bilateral agreements with certain Western countries. I've heard about the contents of the document agreed upon by Zelensky and Sunak, and judging by that document, I do not see any legally binding agreements apart from Ukraine's obligation to defend the British Isles should an invasion be mounted against the UK. Well, somewhat funny, somewhat comedic. Maybe it's a continuation of Neighborhood 95. Maybe the name has been changed at this band of comedians. But be that as it may, these agreements do not change our goals, and this has recently been confirmed by President Putin, in our special military operation, we're going to achieve our goals, doing that persistently and consistently. The goals will be achieved from time to time. The West is sending some signals, then these signals are taken back, as it were. We are taking these signals philosophically. Our president has pointed out on numerous occasions that Russia is not refusing to talk. He said that back in 2022, when at the behest of Boris Johnson and other Anglo-Saxons, Kyiv was forbidden from concluding a settlement agreement with Russia. It happened in April 2022. This story is well known now. And speaking about the subject back in 2022, our president pointed out that Russia did not refuse to talk, but he said that everyone else needs to understand that if they refuse talks, then the longer this would drag on and the more difficult it would be. And we see this prophecy has now come to pass. There are no hopes right now that Russia is going to be somehow defeated. This has been pointed out on multiple occasions. Those who have not learned their history and geography, there are many people like that in the West. They can fantasize about that. They can write yet another scenario for this neighborhood 95, but it's going to have no bearing on life. Sana, agency, please. Sana Agency, Syria channel. Minister, first allow me to wish you a happy New Year. I would like to wish the Russian people victories on every avenue. Right now, the U.S. is establishing military and political coalitions that are mounting an aggression against Yemen. They're also continuing and condoning Israel in the genocide of the Palestinian people, as well as the military action against the peoples of Lebanon and Syria. What's the assessment of Russia with regards to these actions? We have repeatedly made public statements providing our assessment of what is currently unfolding in the Middle East, not just in the Gaza Strip or the Palestinian territories, but also around Lebanon, around Iraq, and around Yemen as well. Indubitably, the US, together with the UK, as well as a number of other allies of theirs, have overstepped and basically trampled into the ground all the norms of international law, including the UN Security Council resolution that has only called for protecting commercial navigation. No one has given any authority to anyone to bomb Yemen, just as not a single authorization has been given back in 2011 to NATO to bomb Libya. The only resolution that was adopted back then was about establishing a no-fly zone above Libya. So it was to prevent the Libyan Air Force from taking to air, and it was not, the forces were not taken to the air. There was no legal authority there, but the country was bombed into nothingness, into a black hole. Right now, no one can put the country back together again. Droves of migrants have rushed to Europe, and this is the bale of Europe, whereas the UK and the US have been spared that, whereas the heart of Africa was engulfed with terrorists that had been used by the West in order to overthrow Gaddafi. And the same chaos and lack of legal observance is seen in the case of Yemen right now, and all the pretexts and justifications coming from Washington seem just pathetic. And against this background, Just a couple of days ago in Davos, State Secretary Blinken made an announcement saying that all the Middle Eastern countries wanted a U.S. presence, and they want that the U.S. should play a leading role in the region. Well, it's difficult for me to judge how big is that desire of theirs. I think we should ask them. But just one of the countries in the Middle East, Iraq, namely, said and made a decision a couple of years ago. This decision was as follows: thank you, Americans, you stayed as guests here for several years, but let's put an end to that and let's see you out. And just recently, we heard from Baghdad that the Americans do not want to go, even though they've been asked to go for quite some time. And that's deplorable. And particularly deplorable is the fact that Blinken has pointed out that only the U.S. can play an intermediary role, only the U.S. is capable of achieving some kind of a settlement between Palestinians and Israelites. You spoke about that. We hear and we know about those semi-official contacts with the participation of the U.S., Israel, several Arab countries, but these contacts do not imply a direct dialogue between Israel and Palestine. These contacts imply that some grown-up adults, grown-up men, are going to reach some kind of agreement and then impose that on Palestinians. But this is not going to work. Only direct dialogue, which needs to be resumed, can be the answer. This dialogue used to happen, albeit arduous and difficult, but some progress was being made with the support of the international intermediary quartet, the quarters of intermediaries in the Middle East, the US, the UN, Russia, and the EU, and we've always advocated the participation of the quartet as well as the Arab League, but that was blocked, that was prevented from happening by the Europeans and the Americans, regrettably, and then the Americans have basically, as they think, disbanded the quartet, monopolizing the mediation process. You might remember that in September last year, National Security Advisor of the U.S., Jake Sullivan, said that never before had the Middle East enjoyed more peace and quiet than several years before, and just several months after, a conflict in the Gaza Strip broke out. So we should probably rely on collective effort, something the U.S. is no longer accustomed to. The U.S. is accustomed to dictating its conditions. On Tuesday next week, there's going to be a special session of the UN Security Council on this subject. We intend to take part in this meeting, and I'm supposed to go to New York to attend this meeting. We are going to present our initiatives with a view to resuming collective effort rather than trying to act on one's own.
It's not that the United States wants to impose their agenda there, but also worldwide. We'll wait and see as it goes. I believe that real life is going to teach our Western colleagues a lesson, as well as the regional countries should insist that it is their place to live, and for them the security of all the nations in the vicinity is decisive. External advice will not be banned, I think, but the final definitive decision rests with the regional stakeholders. And the main area of the efforts would be an establishment of a Palestinian state in line with the UN Security Council decisions in full conformity with those, a state that would be viable and exist in security and good neighborhood side by side with Israel and other regional countries. Otherwise, no matter what is going to happen, we will, I'm sure, see the relapses of the violence that is ongoing in Gaza, because without the Palestinian state established, the people of Palestine will feel oppressed and encroached upon, will live in injustice, and generation after generation of young Palestinians will pass it down to their children. So the definitive outcome must be the establishment of a Palestinian state. I really hope that the Israeli leadership will come to this conclusion. At this point, not everybody in Israel believes it's acceptable for that country. But, you know, nothing can be done about that. We only can dialogue and talk and explain, but without a Palestinian state in place, Israel will not have its security safeguarded, and it's in Russia's interest that the Israelis live in security. It is a long-lasting partner of ours. We were the first nation to recognize their independence. Now, around 2 million citizens reside there and stay there who have double nationality of Israel and Russia. And definitely we care about that, and we are ready to play an active part in guaranteeing a full-fledged settlement that will safeguard Israel's security in full conformity with the UN Security Council's resolutions on the Palestinian issue. International life. Outlet. Well, Mr. Minister, last year, the rumor was, the information was that the United States submitted some written proposals to Russia to launch a negotiation process on arms control. Back then, the MFA of Russia confirmed that, and that an official response was being contemplated. So, after all, was there a response submitted to the ES? And the second point is, do you see any prospects, any future and possibility of resuming the dialogue with the ES on strategic stability? Is it possible? Is it appropriate now? Is it called for, given the current context of the standoff with the West and against the backdrop of the blatantly hostile policies by Washington? Well, with respect to the prospects of resuming the strategic dialogue with the United States, a lot has been said on that of late. And this topic comes up every now and then in conversations, in contacts with mass media, but talking about these prospects in earnest, being adult people, is impossible. Separating that from the overall international situation and the strategic stability situation as of today, the patterns and manifestations are extremely negative, and the things have been aggravating, which has to do primarily with the heightening of the processes that lead the world from a unipolar to a multipolar order, and the West that has been at the helm of the global developments for 500 years definitely is trying to balk fiercely, and where having an eye on that, and they do not want to see this transition to the multipolarity. By this, they are countering the real objective course of history, and they are trying to cling to their global dominance that is slipping away from them and trying to contain these developments. The West stops at nothing in terms of means and ways to counter those who are against those hegemonic feats. And of course, the equality principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Instead, the West has been trying to maintain its unbridled global dominance. Primarily, it is the policy of Washington, but they stumble over more and more obstacles. One of these obstacles is Russia, that has demonstrated resolve not to see its interests encroached, being a great power and one of the global civilizational centers. With respect to the firmness of our policy and our tech, there was a direct relationship between the degree of firmness of ours and the degree of hostility of the United States. And the United States has opted to see the unchecked expansion of the anti-Russian alliance of NATO in the post-Soviet space. They have provoked the Ukrainian conflict, and as you know, we did not put up with the weaponizing of the Kiev regime as a tool to create direct threats to our security, not overseas but close to our borders, next to us, next door. And definitely we would not reconcile ourselves with the use of the Kiev regime in a frontal assault against all Russian things like language, culture, education, and Russian speakers who lived on those territories that had been developed by their forefathers for centuries. And these territories have always remained part of the Russian world, Russian soil, Russian land. And Kiev is meant to be converted into a weapon to destroy common memory and destroy and decouple all kind of ties between the Russian and the Ukrainian peoples, which is also a direct threat to our interests in response to the measures that we took in order to safeguard and protect our interests, our outbound, if I may say so. The United States has unleashed a total hybrid war in order to reach a political and economic and diplomatic strangling on Russia, choke us, and also defeat us in the battlefield. That was all stated in public. In parallel with these developments that we all are witnessing, we do not see any slightest interest in the United States or the West to settle the Ukrainian conflict in a fair way. They do not want to listen to our concerns. They do not want to talk in earnest about removing the fundamental contradictions. On the contrary, the West has been leading towards the escalation of the Ukrainian crisis, which now creates additional strategic risks and perils. You can see as the ex-commanders of the U.S. forces in Europe, Hodges and Breedlove, giving advice, public advice to the Kiev regime to bomb the Crimea into nothing, into submission, so that no one can reside there. But these are retired politicians. With respect to the active politicians, we know for sure that such guidelines and recommendations and advice has been given by the British in their context with the Kiev regime. They not learn lessons of life
И раньше говорили столько,
They
сколько
said that they will
придется.
support Kyiv for
Сейчас
as long
уже
as it
говорят
takes.
столько,
Now
сколько
they
возможно. Это уже
start
такой
saying that
нюанс,
they will support Kyiv for as long as is possible. This is
легкое изменение в оценке
a minor
ситуации.
change reflecting
Ради бога, это
the
их
changing
такие дела.
situation. But, you know, this
Ну,
is up to
например,
them.
пожалуйста,
Well,
где был
to give an instance,
раньше похожий разворот событий?
we
Афганистан.
could see a similar
20 лет
turnaround
там
in
американцы
Afghanistan.
были.
For
Это вот
20
столько,
years, the
сколько
Americans
потребовалось,
stayed
или
there.
столько, сколько было
Was
возможно.
it for as long as it was
Чего они там
necessary,
добились?
or for as long as
Или тот же
it
Ирак,
was possible? Did they
Ливия,
arrive
любые страны, в
at somewhere
которых
there?
США
Did
и
they
их
fulfill something or
сателлиты
anything?
устраивали авантюры, просто
Same refers
пробегитесь, так
to
сказать,
Iraq. All the
мысленно,
reckless
где стало
undertakings of the
лучше,
United
где
States.
утвердилась та самая
military
демократия, ради
field.
которой это все
Did any
затевалось.
of them yield any
И
positive
Украину, к
effect,
сожалению,
any
ждет такая же
establishment
судьба,
of
потому
democracy
что,
that it was all
положившись
had
на
been meant
хозяина,
for, and Ukraine is in for
не
a
понимая,
similar
что
fate. They
хозяин
rely on
думает
their
только о себе,
masters.
а
They
совсем не о тебе,
are not aware that the master
нельзя
only
рассчитывать
thinks
на
of himself, not about
то, что интересы
you,
твоего народа
and you
будут
cannot
каким-то образом
count
учтены.
on
Поэтому вот такое подзуживание,
making allowances for
подталкивание
your
к все
people's
более и
interests.
более
So they have
агрессивному
been nudging
использованию дальнобойных средств
Ukraine to use
для
long-range
нанесения ударов
strike assets
по
and
Крыму,
missiles to
чтобы, в общем-то,
impact
сделать его не
inter
подходящим для проживания. И
the
вглубь
Crimea and
территории
also
Российской Федерации,
the hinterland of
и
the
не
Russian
только подзуживание, но
soil.
и
Apart from the
передача
connivance and nudging, they
соответствующих
have also
вооружений,
been submitting the
это говорит о том,
necessary
что Запад
weapons.
не хочет
And that means that the
никакого
West
конструктивного
is not
решения,
willing to
которое
pursue
учитывало бы
a
законную
constructive
озабоченность
course
Российской
that will
Федерации.
take into account the
Вот. А такая
legitimate concerns of the
деструктивная
Russian
политика,
Federation. So
которую,
such
конечно,
destructive
возглавляет
policies
Соединенными Штатами, привела к очень
on the part of the
глубокой,
United States has led
ну, прямо скажем, деградации российско-американских отношений и коренному изменению
to put it bluntly,
обстоятельств
of
в
the
области
Russian-American
безопасности
relationship and a root
по
and branch
сравнению с
change
теми,
of
которые
the security
существовали,
situation
когда заключался
versus
договор о стратегических наступательных вооружениях.
the period of the
Вашингтон
START
просто
treaty
отбросил
signing.
в сторону все те
Washington has simply cast
понимания, все те
aside
принципы,
all the understandings and
на
principles
которых наши страны в свое время согласились
that
налаживать
underpin
взаимодействие,
the
в том
interaction
числе
between our
взаимодействие по
countries
контролю
back
над
in the
вооружением.
past,
В
including
преамбуле
in the sphere of
договора
arms
об
control.
СНВ
The preamble of this
отражена
START
наша
treaty says
договоренность о
that
приверженности
we reached an
принципу
agreement to
неделимости
be
безопасности,
sticking to the indivisible
когда
security
никто не укрепляет
principle
свою
when
безопасность за счет безопасности другого.
improves one's security at the
Принцип был
expense of the
растоптан
security of the other. This
в
principle was
контексте
trampled
подготовки
upon
и
in
развязывания
the
украинского
context
конфликта.
of preparing and
Также в
unleashing the Ukrainian
преамбуле
conflict.
записано
Also, the
обязательство
preamble of that
России
instrument
и США
says that
устраивать
the
отношения
US
на
and
основе
Russia
доверия и сотрудничества. О каком доверии может сейчас идти речь? Все это прекрасно
would
понимают.
build their relationship
В
on
реальности
basing on
США
the
давно
trust and
сделали ставку на
cooperation.
достижение военного превосходства,
In reality, the United
стремились обеспечить
States
себе свободу
opted
рук,
for
шаг за
a
шагом
military
демонтировали всю систему
prevalence and
соглашения
supremacy,
контроля над
and they
вооружением,
dismantled step
это
by
и
step the
противоракетная оборона, и
the
договор
missile
о ракетах
controls and the arms
средней
controls and
договор
the INF
о
treaty
открытом
and the
небе.
open skies treaty.
Ну и то же самое произошло с договором об обычных
Same
вооруженных
was the
силах в
fate
Европе
of the
и с самим ДСНВ,
CFE
в силу того, что
treaty
США создали
and the START
неприемлемые
itself,
условия для
the START treaty itself,
их
as the
выполнения.
United States
Вот.
created
Именно американская сторона, напомню об этом,
context that
заморозила
would
в
preclude
свое время
its
двусторонний стратегический диалог,
implementation. The American side back
ссылаясь на
then
неблагоприятный военно-политический
froze and
фон, они
suspended
отменили,
the
по-моему,
bilateral
весной,
dialogue,
осенью 22 года,
citing an
раунд,
unfavorable
который
backdrop.
мы были готовы проводить.
They cancelled a
Но
round of
вдруг не
talks
так давно
in
они
2022
снова
December,
вспомнили
if
про
I'm not
важность
mistaken,
контроля
but
над
not long ago they
ядерными
all of a
вооружениями,
sudden
начали нам направлять, в том числе вот на упомянутые вами бумаги,
once again
какие-то
remembered
сигналы, якобы
about
имеющиеся
the
неготовности
importance
возобновить
of a
диалог по этим
strategic
вопросам. Причем
matters
предложили
dialogue, and they have submitted
обособить
some signals,
переговоры
some cues about their
по
readiness, and they
стратегической стабильности
They suggested that the
от
talks on strategic stability should
общего
be set aside
военно-политического контекста.
from the overall
А этот контекст, как вы
military and
можете
political
видеть,
context,
ежедневно
should be
является просто
separated from the overall context. And this context
непримиримо враждебным
is,
по отношению к нам.
irreconcilably
вот мы вас
hostile towards
поносим,
us, and they
на каждом
told us,
углу
well, we keep
называем
chastising
агрессором,
you
требуем, чтобы вы ушли на границы
always,
91
everyone,
года, чтобы
every now and then,
отстали от
and we want
бедной
you to
демократической Украины.
move back to the
Да-да-да, это мы все делаем.
frontiers of the
Ну,
1991
давайте
and
вот
leave
как
the
бы
poor democratic Ukraine alone.
продолжая это
We'll keep
делать,
doing that.
сядем и
But
поговорим по
at the same
конкретной
time,
теме
meanwhile, let's sit down at the table and talk
ограничения стратегических
about the
вооружений, вообще
specific
теме
topic of
стратегического
the
диалога.
strategic
Вы помните, когда
arms control and
назад они
limitations.
эту тему
They
затрагивали исключительно для
Some
того,
time
чтобы
ago, they touched upon this
возобновить
topic
инспекции и посещать
only
наши
in
ядерные
order
объекты.
to
При этом
resume the
поставляли
inspections and
украинцам
visit our
вооружение,
nuclear
с помощью
facilities.
которых
At the same time, they supplied
базы наших стратегических
arms
бомбардировщиков,
to
например,
Ukraine,
подвергались
with the
обстрелу.
help of which our
Люди,
military bases
которые,
of strategic bombers were
наверное, не
protected
знают
and shelled.
даже элементарных
So
приличий.
these are the people
Я уж не
that do
говорю
not
о
know about
комплексном
anything
понимании
about
национальных интересов
conventions
и
or
комплексном
etiquette,
понимании возможного
to say nothing
на
about
международных
the
переговорах. А
comprehensive
здесь даже вот
understanding
элементарные
of
приличия не соблюдаются, но
international
нас это
context and
не
the
удивляет.
framework of
То есть
protected
получается
talks.
так, да, вот вы наш
And
враг,
that does
мы
not
вас
surprise
врагом.
us, and that they have
Ну вот
proclaimed us
насчет того,
openly an
как
enemy.
нам бы
But at
опять
the same
посмотреть на
time,
ваш стратегический ядерный
they
арсенал,
want to have a look at
это
our
другое.
strategic nuclear
Цели понятны по
stockpiles,
лозунгам о взаимности,
because they say it's quite a
постараться
different thing.
каким-то образом
So,
обеспечить
under the slogan of reciprocity,
контроль за
they
нашим ядерным
actually
арсеналом,
want
как я сказал,
to
минимизировать ядерные риски
ensure
для себя.
oversight over
А
our
риски, конечно
nuclear
же,
arsenals
возникают
to
в
minimize
результате
risks for
силового
themselves,
давления
and
на нашу страну.
these risks are mounting as a result of the
Там уже все больше и
military
больше
pressure and
говорят о
compulsion
вероятности
exercise against our country, and they
каких-то сдерживающих
talk
факторов
every day more about
на
the
Западе в этом
prospective
отношении становится все меньше и меньше. И
collision
когда
of nuclear
те
powers,
же
and
поляки,
every day there are
американцы
fewer and
серьезно
fewer
рассуждают о том, что
deterring
надо
factors,
готовить
containing
какие-то
factors,
подразделения
and the Germans in the
натовские
polls speak
для того, чтобы они
publicly in
зашли на
earnest
Украину,
about
заняли там
training
определенные позиции.
some of the
Это
NATO troops
люди,
so that
которые
they should
находятся у
enter the
власти.
Ukrainian soil and
Вот. Поэтому
get
мы
deployed
считаем
there and occupy some
американские
positions.
идеи
These are
неприемлемыми.
people
Они,
in
кстати,
power
не
in those countries, so we believe that American ideas are unacceptable. They have not been concealing their designs while talking about the strategic stability. They're saying that the non-nuclear forces should be factored out and left aside from the talks, so that the West wants to enshrine its advantage and assert its quantitative advantage in terms of these assets. So we do not see, against the backdrop of the hybrid war conducted by Washington against Russia, we do not see any possible grounds to implement any additional measures on the matter of arms control to see the reduction of strategic risks, and we would not see any chance to talk with the United States about the strategic stability. We did not cast it aside altogether for future, and we never did that. Nor we shrugged off the possibility of a diplomatic settlement, but we firmly condition such a possibility on the preliminary
злонамеренного курса на всесторонний подрыв безопасности России и наш
refusal of the West to pursue their comprehensively aggressive attack against our country, trying to subvert every domain of ours. Apart from that, any hypothetical and prospective interaction in future in the matter of strategic stability would require the United States to get ready to consider this topic, taking into account the full plethora of the factors that have a bearing on the strategic stability, not only the aspects that are of the strategic stability that are in the interest of Washington. They do not want and
Но и тем более
are not
сейчас
eager to
не может
contemplate
произойти
the
в
strategic
нынешних
stability
условиях.
comprehensively, and it
Вот,
cannot
поэтому понадобится устранить
happen in the current
критически
context,
значимые
so
противоречия в
critically
области
important
безопасности,
contradictions
которые
must be
несет
lifted
экспансия
and
НАТО на
removed.
восток. Напомню,
I'm
об этом
referring to
мы
the
говорили
NATO's
еще в
expansion
декабре
eastwards, and this is
2021
something
года.
we
Вернее,
talked
говорили
about
об
in
этом
December
давно.
2021.
В
Well,
декабре
we had
2021
talked
года
about
выдвинули
that long ago,
конкретные
but in December
предложения,
2021 we
которые
came up with
предотвратить
specific proposals
нынешний конфликт,
that
тем самым
were capable of
спасти бы
preventing the
экономику
current
Европы,
conflict and save
которую сейчас
Europe's
американцы
economy
топят активно
that
и
is now being
результативно.
drowned by
Но
the
наши предложения
Americans
декабря 2021 года
with a
были
lot of
ответом
effect,
на
but they spurned
Вот.
our
Что
proposals back
касается
then.
вопроса о том, информировали ли мы об
As
этом
for your
американцев,
question
да,
about
мы
whether
в
we have
декабре
informed the Americans about that,
23 года
in
передали
December 2023,
вот те мысли, которые я сейчас так
we
изложил,
sent our
в общем
ideas that I
плане,
have briefly outlined
изложили
just now
на бумаге,
to them as a
как и те письменные предложения,
paper,
которые нам американцы
just like
передали. Эти
the
оценки
written
не
proposals
предупредили об этом
sent
Вашингтон, эти
to us
оценки
by the
для
Americans.
нас
These
безальтернативны,
assessments have
и
no
мы исходим
alternative
из
to
того, что в
us,
этом вопросе
and
не
we
осталось
suppose
никакой
that
недосказанности.
everything has been said on that matter,
просто
and there is
Синьхуа.
nothing left to say. Xinhua, please.
Здравствуйте.
Надо нажать кнопочку
Make sure to
микрофона.
switch on your mic, please.
Да.
У вас в подлокотнике
In
микрофона
your armrest, you have the
это все
microphone.
работает просто.
Может, японский он?
Maybe that's a Japanese mic. That could be the problem.
Алло. Здравствуйте.
Good
Сергей
afternoon,
Викторович, меня зовут
Minister Lavrov.
я корреспондент Синьхуа.
I'm a
У
reporter
меня к
from
вам такой
Xinhua.
вопрос. Если бы вас попросили одним или
My
несколькими
question is,
словами
if we
оценить
were to ask
результаты
you to
китайско-российских
describe the
отношений в
results of the work in
2023 году,
Russian-Chinese
то
relations in
какое слово или слова вы бы
2023 in 2 or 3
выбрали?
words,
Почему?
what would be
И
these
чего вы
words and
ожидаете
why?
от двусторонних
What
отношений
do
в
you
этом году?
expect our
Спасибо.
bilateral relations to be like in
Я уже
2024?
говорил в своем
Thank you.
вступительном слове, что
In my
российско-китайские
introductory remarks,
отношения,
I
как
have already
неоднократно
mentioned
подчеркивали
that
наши лидеры,
just like our leaders have
переживают
repeatedly said,
наилучший
Russian-Chinese
период за всю
relations are
свою
going through
историю.
the best period in their history.
Было записано в ряде деклараций,
There
принятых
has
на
been a
высшем уровне,
number of
что
summit-level
эти отношения
declarations
прочнее,
that
надежнее
stipulate that these
и
relations
более
are now
продвинуты,
stronger,
нежели
more
военный
reliable,
союз в
and more
его
advanced than a
прежнем
military alliance,
понимании эпохи Холодной войны.
as it was
На самом
seen
деле
during the
это
Cold
отражает
Era war,
реальное
Cold War
положение
era.
дел. Нет такой сферы деятельности человека, где
Naturally,
наши
it does
отношения
not
с Китайской
reflect
Народной
any
Республикой не
spheres where
переживали бы
our
бурный подъем.
relations
Экономика,
with China wouldn't be
200-миллиардный
flourishing.
барьер, который был обозначен в качестве цели, в прошлом
The
году был
200
существенно
billion
превышен.
barrier that
И
was
эта
set as a
тенденция будет
purpose
продолжаться.
was actually
Причем
surpassed
этой
last
тенденции
year, and
будет
this
способствовать
trend
то
is
обстоятельство, что в
continuing
условиях,
to
когда
go
Запад
on.
разрушает
And
все
now that the West is
основы
destroying the
продвигавшейся
foundations
им самим
of
глобализации
globalizations that
и
it
прибегает
itself
к
had
инструментам
promoted,
санкций и
that the
прочим
West is using
нелегитимным
sanctions-based
мерам,
tools and
мы
other
переходим
illegitimate
на
measures. We, on the other hand,
механизмы развития нашей
are
торговли,
switching
инвестиционного
to different
сотрудничества, которые не
mechanisms,
будут
developing
подвержены
our trade and
какому-либо
investment
западному влиянию. В
cooperation that would
частности,
not be subject to
национальные валюты
Western
уже составляют
influence.
90%
National currencies now account for about 90%
уже
of
где-то около
money used in
90%.
our
Этот процесс
bilateral
идет
trade
со
turnover.
многими другими странами.
Similar
Действуют
trends are visible in our trade relations with other
механизмы
countries too.
не только саммитов
Not only
президента
summit
России,
mechanisms,
председателя КНР,
namely meetings between
есть
the Russian and the Chinese
механизм
presidents,
ежегодных встреч глав
but there is
правительств,
also the
в
mechanism
рамках
of
которых
annual meetings between heads of
подготовительная работа
government,
ведется в 5
which
межправительственных комиссиях,
account for the
возглавляемых 30
preparatory work in
Такого
various
разветвленного
intergovernmental commissions
механизма
headed by
сотрудничества на таком
deputy prime
высоком уровне у
ministers.
нас нет ни с одной другой
We
страной.
don't have
И
such
вот
a
эта структура
level of broad economic relations with any other country. This strategic interaction and comprehensive cooperation enables us not only to coordinate our mutually beneficial cooperation and various projects, but also enables us to work to bring these ideas to life. Annually, we hold cultural events. Humanitarian educational cooperation is also underway. I think that these relations are very promising in accordance with the guiding principles decided on here in Russia in March 2023, when President Xi visited Russia after his re-election, as well as in October, where President Putin was the guest of honor at the Third Belt and Road International Forum. In 2024, we have already scheduled a series of events that will continue the trend of our high-level and highest-level cooperation in all avenues of Russian-Chinese cooperation and partnership. There is a plethora of words that would describe in superlative terms our excellent cooperation, but I don't want to choose just one or two or three words. However, the exception to that would be the word friendship. You probably remember, Russians and Chinese are brothers forever. This saying was very popular in the Soviet era, here in the Soviet Union. Maybe it was a bit artificial because, truth be told, Soviet-Chinese relations soured a little bit after that, but right now, more and more Russians visit China as tourists or for business, as part of cultural and educational exchanges. When our compatriots, when our fellow Russians share their impressions about the communication with ordinary Chinese people, when they go to China and meet Chinese people, they are always full of enthusiasm and exuberance when they describe this feeling of mutual liking. Right now, we are actively promoting cross-border ties between neighboring regions of Russia and China, and it is, of course, also part of the overall positive trend. Naturally, some tasks need to be resolved. A lot remains to be done in economy, trade, because naturally everyone is interested in getting the best deal possible. But in any case, without exception, Russia and China's interests always come to a common denominator, and we are able to resolve any and all issues that arise. TASS agency, please.
Здравствуйте, Сергей Викторович, агентство ТАСС, Попов Артем. У
Minister
меня два
Lavrov, good
вопроса
afternoon,
коротких,
Artyom
буквально на одном
Popov,
выдохе.
TASS agency.
Лидеры Армении и
The
Азербайджана
leaders of
недавно
Armenia and
обменялись резкими
Azerbaijan recently
заявлениями.
exchanged
Камнем
some cutting
преткновения стал
remarks.
вопрос о сообщении между
The
Азербайджаном
issue
и
at
Нахичевани.
hand was
Баку требует, чтобы грузы и люди
the
передвигались на этом пути
communication
без
between
проверок, иначе
Azerbaijan
граница с
and
Арменией не будет открыта в
Armenian
любом другом месте.
borders.
В Ереване с подобной
And
риторикой не
reopening
согласны.
the borders.
Как вы можете
Armenia has
прокомментировать
a
это, не
different opinion
помешает
on
ли
the
такой
matter.
обмен
What's your take on
с
that?
резкими заявлениями
Will this
процесса
exchange of
нормализации
cutting
между Баку и
remarks
Ереваном? Это первый
hinder
вопрос.
the
И
normalization
второй,
of
последние дни
Armenia-Azerbaijani
в
relations?
СМИ
My second
появился
question
целый
is
ряд
recently in the
публикаций
media
возможных
a
чуть
number
ли не прямых
of
переговоров между Россией и
articles
Украиной.
were
И более
published
того,
about the
Женева
possibility of
называется как
possible
площадка,
direct
которая могла
negotiations
бы
between Russia
устроить
and
обе
Ukraine,
стороны.
with Geneva
Так ли
mentioned as
это?
a
Готова
possible
ли
platform
Москва
for
к
such
такому сценарию?
negotiations.
Спасибо.
Is that true? Is Moscow ready for such a scenario? As for
армяно-азербайджанского
the
урегулирования,
Armenian-Azerbaijani settlement,
действительно, в последние дни
true enough, in
лидеры
the
Армении
past
и
few days,
Азербайджана
Armenian and
затрагивали в своих
Azerbaijani
публичных
leaders,
комментариях
in
тему
their public remarks, touched upon the
установления
topics of
связи между
establishing ties
основной частью
between
Азербайджана
the
и
Azerbaijani
Нахичевани.
mainland, so to say, and Nakhchivan.
Причем премьер-министр Пашинян
And Prime Minister
где-то
Pashinyan
сказал, что
also said
Армения
that
категорически
Armenia
против Зангезурского
categorically
коридора.
rejected the Zangezur
Про Зангезурский
corridor.
коридор никогда речь не шла в
This
рамках тех
corridor
договоренностей,
was
которые
not
были
part of
достигнуты
the
президентом
agreements reached
Путиным,
by President
президентом Алиевым
Putin,
и
President
премьером
Aliyev, and
Пашиняном.
Prime Minister Pashinyan.
В заявлении, которое было подписано
In
9
the
ноября
statement
2020 года,
signed on
и
November
которое
the 9th,
остановило
2020, that
войну,
put an end to the
там
war,
было сказано, что
said
разблокируются все экономические и
deblocking
транспортные
all economic
связи,
and transport
и
ties.
далее, что Армения
It also
гарантирует
said that Armenia would
безопасность
guarantee
транспортного сообщения
safety
между западными
of
районами
transport
Азербайджана и Нахичеванью
between
в обоих
Azerbaijan
направлениях,
and Nakhchivan
а контроль
in both
за
directions.
этим
And that
транспортным
control
сообщением
over this
осуществляют органы
transport
пограничной службы
would be
ФСБ
within the
Российской
remit of
Федерации.
the border
Это
service
практически
of the Russian
цитата
Federal
из
Security
того
Service.
документа, который
I
в
almost
трехстороннем
quoted
формате
that
был
document
подписан
that
9
was
ноября
signed on November the
2020
9th,
года.
2020,
Поэтому
trilaterally.
как-то, да, и то, что сказал господин Пашинян,
The remarks
что
made
он
by
хочет
Mr. Pashinyan,
то ли таких же условий для
who
транзита
said that
через
he wanted
Армению,
similar
которые
terms for transit through
будут
Armenia,
использоваться при транзите из
similar
Азербайджана
to
в
the
Нахичевань
ones
через иранскую территорию. Здесь
that would be
я
used for
не
transit from
увидел здесь
Azerbaijan to
какой-то
Nakhchivan
логики, откровенно говоря,
via
едва ли
Iran.
уместно сравнивать
I
эти
can
маршруты.
hardly follow the logic
В
because
рамках
these
трехсторонней
routes are
рабочей
hardly
группы, которая была
compatible.
создана в
It's impossible
2021
to
году на
compare
уровне
them.
вице-премьеров
The
России, Армении и
Deputy
Азербайджана,
Prime
было
Minister
условлено,
level
что
working group
при
established in
разблокировании всех связей
2021
и
agreed
всех маршрутов
that
страны, по
when
территории
transport and
которых
logistic ties
любой вот такой
are improved
разблокированный
and
маршрут
routes are
проходит, в
deblocked,
полной мере
the
сохраняют
countries
суверенитет и
preserve
юрисдикцию
sovereignty and
над этими
jurisdiction
маршрутами
over
на своей
these
территории,
routes on
повторю
their
еще раз.
territory. An
И
important point to reiterate.
в трехсторонней рабочей группе
In the
еще
trilateral working group
в мае
in
2023
May
года
2023,
вернее, в июне, в мае было
correction,
поручено,
in
в
June,
июне они
the
договорились на уровне
trilateral working
вице-премьеров
group
о том, чтобы возобновить
at the
такое
level of deputy prime ministers came to an
сообщение
agreement about
для начала
resuming
железнодорожным транспортом.
railroad
Это было
transport.
согласовано, это потом обсуждалось
That was agreed upon,
президентом
that
Путиным в
was also
Ереване,
discussed
когда
by President
он там
Putin
был
in
с визитом,
Yerevan when
и
he
была
paid a
встреча
visit to
отдельная
Armenia.
с
There
премьером
was a
Пашиняном
separate
на
meeting
полях
with
саммита
Prime Minister
ОДКБ.
Pashinyan on the
Я
sidelines
прекрасно
of the
помню, как
CSTO
это было
summit.
встречено
And I remember that
весьма
meeting.
позитивно,
It
но
was a
потом
very
куда-то все
positive
опять
one, but
ушло. И
after that, it just
мы,
went up into
конечно,
the air
хорошо
for some
понимаем,
reason.
что вот такие
And we
откаты
are very
от
clear
достигнутых
that
договоренностей,
such
это
setbacks
дело, к сожалению,
after
нередкое. И
agreements reached
что помешало
is not a rare occurrence.
завершить эти договоренности на бумаге о принципах
What became the
открытия
obstacle from finalizing these agreements on paper about the principles of deblocking the transport cohesion between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan? We only know that the kind advice made by the Western friends are always there in the South Caucasus. And sometimes these advice are perceived by certain participants of the process very seriously. But the Western advice is typically aimed not at looking for agreements between regional countries on the basis of balance of interests, but rather on promoting the West's own geopolitical interests. There is no alternative to resuming this transport communication, and its parameters have been enshrined in the trilateral documents. The route goes through Armenia's sovereign territory controlled by the border service of the Russian Federal Security Service. The document also established the procedure for border and customs control at the entry point to Armenia from Azerbaijan and at the exit point from Armenia to the Azerbaijani Nakhchivan. As for the rumors about direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, well, that's what they are, rumors. Everyone is clear that it's not Ukraine that will decide when to stop, when to begin serious talks about realistic terms to putting an end to the conflict. And that would naturally mean rejecting its Nazi ideology and rhetorics, rejecting racism regarding everything Russian, rejecting their aspirations to NATO membership. These are not dreams. These are terms for preserving the Ukrainian nation as an independent nation that would have its own identity rather than just carry out somebody else's orders.
неспокойное состояние, так скажем. Нет,
To
и, конечно, говорить об этом
vex
надо с
Russia.
Западом. Вы уже
Naturally, we need to speak to the West about that, and today we have already spoken about how
апреле
in April
2022 Запад запретил
the West
Украине
prohibited Ukraine
подписывать договоренности.
from signing the agreements.
Точно так же Запад не заинтересован в том, чтобы какие-то переговоры сейчас
The West is not interested
Команду
in
дает точно
any
совершенно
negotiations.
Вашингтон.
Clearly
И
and evidently, it is Washington that is calling the
вот,
shots.
кстати, в Давосе
In
Блинкен,
Davos,
если я правильно помню,
Blinken,
сказал, что
if I
сейчас
remember
не
correctly,
видит
said
даже близкой
he didn't
перспективы
see even a
переговоров
remote
по
prospect for
не то что по
negotiations,
регулированию,
not
а
just
по
on the settlement,
долгосрочному
but also
перемирию
on
на
a
Украине.
long-term
Они
truce
про
in Ukraine.
урегулирование это вообще не хотят
They
говорить.
don't even want to
Иногда
talk about
проскакивает у них по Фрейду
Ukrainian settlement.
тема
Sometimes they make
объявления
Freudian
перемирия,
slips
чтобы
when they said declaring a
подкачать оружие
truce
Украине,
to
так же, как они
supply
использовали
Ukraine with
Минские
more
договоренности.
weapons. This is what they did with the
И,
Minsk agreements.
знаете, вот недавно, в том же Давосе, говоря про Минские
Speaking of
договоренности,
the Minsk
в том же
agreements,
Давосе
it was
Зеленский
in Davos that
подробно,
Zelensky
с выражением,
detailed
ну, не
with
так
great
ярко,
gusto.
как в квартале 95,
Well, maybe he wasn't
говорил
in his top
про
form, just like he was during his
Минские договоренности.
quartal
Он обвинил
95
Россию и
days.
лично
But he
президента
spoke
Путина в
about the
том,
Minsk
что
agreements and
он,
accused Russia
Путин
and
и
President
Россия
Putin personally
украли у мира
of
13
stealing
лет мира,
13 years of
прямо
peace
заявив,
from the world.
что
He made a
после
direct claim that
2014
after
года,
2014,
естественно, тогда все начал московский режим, как они говорят.
and he said that it was the Moscow regime, as they say, started it. There was no coup
Ну, все
d'etat.
это ставится с ног на
There
голову.
was just
Но
the
он
annexing
заявил,
of Crimea.
что после 2014 года
And he said that after
Германия и
2014,
Франция
Germany and
так
France
постарались, договорились о
tried
промежуточном
their best
решении в виде
and
Минских
agreed upon
договоренностей.
an
А Путин все
intermediary
испортил.
solution, and
Это
Putin
поразительно,
ruined it
как
all.
человек
It is
может
flabbergasting how a man
с голубыми или какие там у него глазами
can
излагать
just
подобные вещи. Всем хорошо
unblinkingly
известно, что, во-первых,
say
что
such
Минские
things
договоренности
with such
были никаким
frankness,
не промежуточным
because the
этапом.
Minsk agreements were not an
Они
intermediary step.
предполагали
They
окончательное
were supposed to
закрытие
be
этой
the
проблемы.
final
И они были утверждены Советом
decision
Безопасности.
made
А
regarding
во-вторых,
this problem.
эти Минские договоренности, как вы
Secondly,
знаете,
as you probably know, the
не
Minsk
были
agreements
разрушены
were
Путиным.
not destroyed by
И
Putin.
Меркель и Оланд
Merkel
не
and
пытались
Hollande were
сделать
not
так, чтобы они
trying to
сработали.
ensure that
И та, и
these
другой признали,
agreements
что они
work. Both Merkel and
подписали
Hollande
эти договоренности
confessed
только
to
чтобы
having
выиграть
signed
время
these
и
agreements just
готовить
to
Украину
gain
к
some
войне.
time to prepare
Вот.
Ukraine for the war.
То есть это очевидные факты. Они звучали в публичном пространстве многократно. Их анализировали, обсуждали, комментировали многие политики и журналисты. Но Зеленский, ничто же сумняшься, просто врет мировому сообществу с трибуны того самого Всемирного экономического форума в Давосе. Поэтому как с такими людьми разговаривать? Тем более, что его декрет, запрещающий переговоры с Россией, до сих пор
even though his decree, especially because his decree prohibiting Ukraine from talking to Russia has not been annulled. President Putin has said that first the decree has to be abolished. And then we'll see. Armenian news agency, please. Minister Lavrov, I've got two questions. Yes, we can hear you. The first question, the interview by Ilham Aliyev has been mentioned. It had some harsh remarks with regard to Armenia. Armenia has already criticized that, and there have been some statements about backsliding in the negotiating process. What's your current assessment of the current negotiating process between Baku and Yerevan on the subject? And my second question, what of relations between Armenia and Russia? Have the issues been resolved, and what's the progress? As far as the Armenia-Azerbaijani settlement goes, I believe we should be coy. We should go as far as to say that the 2020-2022 agreements, trilateral settlements, agreements that were signed were very important. I've spoken about the first statement just recently, and it's regrettable that such a practically beneficial issue to Armenia as the deblocking the route is still on the paper. And with all due respect, I think the reason is the position of Yerevan. I do not know where they get their advice from, but maybe some advice does come through. We saw Germany, the US, France. As soon as they realized that the Russian-Armenian-Azerbaijani process is yielding some results in deblocking the routes, in delineating the border, in drafting a peace agreement, started to insert themselves into these processes without any invitation, playing the role of a spoiler. Just remember 2003 and Transnistria. Back then, Russia was acting as an intermediary, and in 2003, Dmitry Kozak, who back then was responsible for this dossier, managed to agree upon the so-called Cossack Memorandum, which was initialed by both sides, and the signing agreement was planned. Back then, the president of Moldova made a call to President Putin, and he said, I'm sorry, yes, we did initial the agreement, but the EU forbids us from signing the memorandum because the document does not have some things the EU wants to be reflected there. It was not an agreement with the EU, it was an agreement between Transnistria and Moldova. So 20 years ago, the Moldovan issue, the Transnistrian issue, could have been settled, just as it was the case 7 years ago with Ukraine, when the Minsk agreement were adopted. I've got every ground to believe that the West is reluctant to see the agreements facilitated by Russia between Baku and Yerevan coming into reality. I've spoken about the road through Sanitsky region. Armenia has some
issues
with deblocking the route, as it was stipulated in the trilateral statement. Armenia is putting forth additional requirements with regard to ensuring security along the road. They do not want Russian border guards for being stationed there, even though that's been enshrined in the document. They do not want neutral customs and border controls. They want to do that on their own, which goes contrary to what had been agreed upon. And the same goes for the delimitation of the border. We offered our services, moreover, the two sides signed an agreement on establishing a delimitation committee, which would include the Russian side as an intermediary. We have not been invited to this committee. Charles Michel has already announced that it's the EU that is going to work on delimitation, even though, if my geography knowledge serves me right, neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan have never been part of any countries that are currently part of the EU, so they do not have the maps, whereas Russia does have the necessary maps, and something both sides are happy with, but the EU is not happy with that, and the US also wants to delimit the border from across the Atlantic. Somehow they have come into possession of some maps from the Russian from the USSR general staff. You know, it does seem somewhat bizarre. These are adults who are trying to fight for supremacy, who is better, who is more important, who can get additional scores in international affairs. It's deplorable that the self-serving interests of the West prevent Armenia and Azerbaijan from putting into reality their vital, essential interests. As far as Russia and Armenia are concerned, we've never been at the origins of any cooling in our ties. Yes, we remember that many of the officials of Armenia, who back then were in opposition, made some statements during the electoral campaign. They made calls for withdrawal from the Eurasian Economic Union, from the CSTO. And once Prime Minister Pashinyan arrived in office, we didn't have the slightest urge, as it were, to distance ourselves from Yerevan. In our relations, things continued as they had before in economics, in military, in politics, in other fields. But what you're currently witnessing, you know, I personally participated in the talks that took place in Yerevan in 2022. There was a meeting of the CSTO, and a document was endorsed stipulating the dispatch of observers to the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The document was agreed upon. Then the leadership of Armenia said that they were not willing, they were not ready to sign the document right away, and almost at the same time an EU mission was dispatched there, but that was the choice made by the Armenian leadership. The EU mission started to make active inquiries into the activities of our border guards stationed in Armenia, rather than working on confidence-building measures. They were trying to sniff out what was happening, what Russia was doing, what Russia was involved in, what goals it was pursuing. This is also well known. We've spoken about that with our Armenian friends. We said, yes, okay, there is an EU mission, and you're more happy with that, but why not extend a parallel invitation to the
Ответ
CSTO.
в том плане, что ОДКБ
The answer was,
разочаровал Армению.
the STO has been a disappointment to Armenia because it has not
Ответ знаем. Но если
condemned Azerbaijan. Yes, we know this response.
вот по истории этого
But
конфликта,
if we
к его
have a
началу,
look at the original causes of the conflicts, then we'll see at each turn, each and every side, both Armenia and Azerbaijan,
деяний, которые явно не
made so
способствовали
many steps
прогрессу,
that
что мы можем так далеко зайти.
didn't assist
Либо,
progress
значит, мы
in the
ищем где-то
least. So we could
виноватых
go
и
somewhat
отказываемся
too
от
far.
существующих сегодня возможностей.
It would be just
Реально
trying to shift the
получить
blame
содействие
instead of
в укреплении
trying to
границ.
implement the
И
current
тогда мы,
agreements that would allow
работаем
achieving
нашими
real
западными
progress in
коллегами,
delimiting
как,
the
мне
border.
кажется, уже публично заявили в Армении,
I think
что и
our Western,
ОДКБ разочаровала, и Россия разочаровала.
I think
вот
Armenia
Запад
has
не
made
разочаровал.
statements that the
Но это
CSTO and
выбор
Russia have been a
армянского
disappointment, whereas the
еще раз
West
говорю.
has
Да,
not.
у
But
нас
it's the
есть
choice
в нашем
up to the
обществе, в
Armenian leadership.
политических
Yes, in
кругах,
our
в средствах
society,
массовой
among the
информации
political
есть
scientists and among
мнения
the
на этот
media,
счет.
there are certain
И эти
opinions
мнения
on the
достаточно
subject,
свободно
and sometimes
высказываются.
these
За
opinions are
некоторые
expressed
высказывания
very
армянское
freely,
правительство даже объявило
and for certain
персонами нон-грата.
comments,
Всем ряд
some
граждан Российской
people
Федерации, что,
have
конечно, в
been
отношениях
declared
между
persona
союзниками
non grata by the Armenian
достаточно
government, which
необычное
is
развитие событий.
somewhat,
Была история вокруг международного
this is
уголовного
not
суда.
seldom seen, often
Мы
seen in
откровенно,
relations between
по-дружески
allies,
советовали,
between
как
close
это
friends.
сделать так, чтобы цель, которая была объявлена главной
We
при
have
вступлении в
made
Международный уголовный суд при подписании статута
many
этого суда,
efforts to provide
как она может быть
advice,
достигнута без
when
совершения
the
этого достаточно противоречивого
charter,
шага.
the Rome Statute was
Находимся в контакте и всегда в
signed by
диалоге
Armenia.
открыты.
We were providing alternative
Но
paths to achieving the same
то, что Запад
goals
публично
Armenia was pursuing in
заявляет о
doing so.
необходимости убрать Россию из Южного Кавказа, это тоже всем известно.
And there are
Каких-то
often
возражений из
statements
Еревана мы не слышали.
from the
Мы
West that
предложили,
Russia
кстати
needs to
сказать,
be
активно
chased away from
развивать
South
механизм
Caucasus, and we do not
сотрудничества трех южнокавказских
hear
стран,
many
Армении,
statements to the country from
Азербайджана и Грузии,
Yerevan.
и трех их ближайших больших соседей,
But
России,
I think
Турции и
Russia,
Ирана.
Turkey,
Пара
Iran,
встреч
the
состоялась,
closest
армянские
countries
представители
to the
участвовали. Мне
South
кажется, со
Caucasus,
временем именно
together
этот
with the
формат
three countries of the Southern
будет
Caucasus,
перспективным, потому что
Georgia,
он не
Armenia,
зависит
Azerbaijan,
от
they
какой-то
need to work
глобальной
together. We propose this
геополитической
format, and I think this format is going to prevail sooner or later
И
because
он
it's not dependent on the
свободен
global
от той
geopolitical environment. Moreover, this
геополитической
format is
игры
immune to the
сохранения
geopolitical
гегемонии.
machinations with a view to preserving hegemony
Вашингтон
currently
вместе со
pursued
своими
by Washington
коллегами
together with its
из Брюсселя.
counterparts from
Еще раз
Brussels.
подчеркну,
I would like
у
to
нас
reiterate once
очень
again,
теплые
we have
отношения к
very
армянскому народу.
warm
Мы
relations with the Armenian people.
уверены в том, что
We
история
have
все
confidence
расставит по
that
своим
history
местам,
is going to
но
put things right.
в одиночку мы не решим всех этих проблем.
On our own,
Я
we
не
will
хочу
not be able to
банальную
solve
фразу
all these
употреблять: для
problems.
танго нужны двое.
I would hate,
В Армении
to
более такие
use the
горячие
hackneyed
танцы, я
phrase
знаю,
that,
поэтому
it takes two to tango. Armenia has some more interesting dances than that.
Здравствуйте, Сергей Викторович. Мария Владимировна, коллеги,
Minister,
информационный портал news.ru,
Madam
Рустам.
Spokesperson,
В продолжение темы Южного Кавказа
As a
хотелось
follow-up
бы
on the
уточнить,
subject of
вот
South
официальные
Caucasus, I
лица
would like
России не раз
to
отмечали
clarify.
усилия
Russian
Москвы, в
officials
частности президента России Владимира
have
Путина,
spoken about
в
Moscow's efforts,
нормализации
President Putin's efforts
ситуации в Карабахе.
in
Вот
normalizing the
азербайджанский
situation
президент
in
недавно в своем
Karabakh.
интервью
And
заявил о том, что
recently in
именно
his interview,
Путин, а не
President
Макрон
Aliyev said
помог
it had
восстановить
been
мир
Putin, not
на
President
Южном
Macron,
Кавказе.
who
Вот скажите,
had helped re-establish peace in the South Caucasus, President Aliyev. So can you tell us whether that increases the possibility of a peace treaty between Baku and Yerevan being signed on the Russian platform? And second question, if you'll allow me, a couple of weeks ago, the ministry expressed a hope that Afghanistan is going to emerge from international isolation. Kazakhstan put Taliban off the list of prohibited organizations. So is there a chance that Afghanistan is going to emerge from political diplomatic isolation? And can the same process be applied to Yemen? In particular through the recognition of Houthis, because de facto they've been controlling the capital for quite some time, as well as a bigger chunk of the territory of Yemen. I forgot what you started with. Well, about President Putin having played a role in normalizing relations between Baku and Yerevan, so not Macron, but Putin. The thing is, the agreement was signed by the three leaders of Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. I didn't see the signature of President Macron there. And the same goes for the other trilateral agreements and documents signed by the three countries. And I said that on multiple occasions once these agreements started to be put into practice, in particular with regard to the deblocking the roads and also the delimiting of the borders and working on the peace treaty. Once this started to happen, the Americans and the Europeans started to insert themselves actively into these processes. And you know, there was one interesting issue. Remember the documents signed in November 2020, as well as the subsequent documents. In those documents, the territory of Karabakh was designated as an area under the responsibility of the Russian peacekeeping corps. And there was an understanding between the three countries that the status would be a subject for further discussion with a view to finding a final solution. So imagine our surprise when in autumn 2022, somewhere in Prague, if my memory serves me right, President Macron held the European political community conference. So we and Ukrainians were not invited to, even though Armenia and Azerbaijan were represented there. And I think President Macron, together with Charles Michel, proposed a meeting. And during that meeting, they agreed a document saying that Armenia and Azerbaijan recognized the territorial integrity of one another in full conformity with the 1991 Almaty Declaration. And that declaration said that all newly independent countries had borders identical to the administrative borders of the Soviet republics of the USSR. So Karabakh was supposed to be a part of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic, the borders of the autonomous region of Karabakh. We did not know that such a document was in the works. So we made a conclusion. We communicated to Baku and Yerevan. We thought that the issue of Karabakh had been closed personally by Prime Minister Pashinyan, and President Macron had taken part in that process. And I do not know who played what role, and I would be loath to speculate. But our Western counterparts want a peace agreement to be signed in their territory. Azerbaijan is willing to sign a peace agreement in the Russian territory, where efforts originated to normalize the situation, to find a settlement. But it's a fact too. Whether Yerevan is willing to do that, I do not know. even though we've been sending the relevant signals for quite some time to the capital of Armenia. As for Afghanistan, there are de facto authorities that are really in control of the situation. Yes, there are some hotbeds of protest and of tensions, but generally the Taliban movement is in control, and our embassy never stopped working in Kabul, and it was almost the single embassy that continued working.
We've been maintaining regular contacts with Taliban, including an inter alia on issues that should be resolved so that Taliban is recognized as a legitimate government, and most importantly, it's about them to keep their promise of creating an inclusive government that would represent not only ethnic Pashto and other ethnic minorities and groups, but also would be politically inclusive. There are Pashto and Uzbek and Tajik and Hazar people there, but politically they're Talibs. While politically there is still some opposition left, and the ex-president Karzai still lives there, as well as the former chief executive Abdallah, and we advise the Talibs to invite other political forces into a coalition. And the second issue to be resolved is the national opposition front in the north, and bridges must be built there too. It has never been simple in Afghanistan, you know, so it is not simple now either. But we have been keeping a constant eye on what has been happening, and we maintain contacts with the leadership, and that helps us work, including in promoting external formats that help come out with recommendations and guidelines for the Afghans themselves. I'm referring to the Moscow format and the quartet of Russia, China, Pakistan, and Iran. I hope that the current exchange of barbs between Iran and Pakistan will not be a drag on that. Well, but, you know, Kazakhstan made a special mention that putting Taliban off the terrorist list would not automatically mean a recognition. These are relative things, you know. Even the UN Security Council issued a reservation on the Taliban leaders on those lists, that if it is about prospective talks, in these cases, in these events, the leaders of Taliban should be put off the lists and excluded from the lists. As regards Yemen, well, you know, after many years, contacts were launched upon the initiative of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are now in talks with the Houthis whether it's viable to resume the talks. I do not know. It is hard to say. The main point now is to stop the aggression against Yemen. The more the Americans and the British bomb Yemen, the less is the Houthis' desire to speak. But this is the inherent style of our Anglo-Saxon colleagues. They always want to trouble the waters everywhere, and later from the overseas, from the English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean coast, try to figure how to promote their self-serving interests. Российская газета, newspaper. Microphone. Good afternoon. My question is as follows. This 80 years since the deblocking of Leningrad is marked this year. Russia has always wanted to assist all the prisoners and victims of the blockade. Recently, the Rossiyskaya Gazeta made public some data that around 50,000 people receive financial assistance, including those residing in the EU, while Germany maintains double standards in paying out compensations upon contrived reasons. The Germans only pay the allowances to Jews, the compensation to Jews, and they would not encompass all other survivors of the blockade. Can you comment on that? We have been addressing that for many years. When Berlin started paying one-off compensations to the Jewish blockade survivors, we stated it was not fair, and we attracted the attention of the Germans. Back when Steinmeier was the foreign minister, the current president, and I explained it to him repeatedly that a lot of people died and suffered irrespective of what their nationality or ethnicity was: Russians, Tatars, Jews, and many other ethnicities. The response was as follows: we are paying to the Jews because we have a law that obliges us to pay amounts to Holocaust victims. All others cannot fall under this category. I thought it was blatantly absurd, and I told him that blockade was a unique phenomenon of the World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, when there was no distinction between those who survived by eating stray cats and boiling boots to have broth and burying people. We just wanted to put them to shame. We failed, and the answer was, well, as the Holocaust law allows for payments, we execute those. But if we pay out amounts to all those who would not fall under this category of Holocaust victims, we will have an influx of lawsuits. I suggested they would enact a special law on the Leningrad blockade survivors, which would be natural. They rejected and came forth with an idea of establishing a house of veterans in St. Pete and a Russian-German cultural center. I said it was instrumental and useful, probably to promote our civil society's conflicts, but that would not solve the issue of the blockade survivors, even if they
Подавляющее большинство оставшихся в живых блокадников живут не в Питере.
Happy with visiting that cultural center. This is not sufficient because the bulk of the survivors live outside St. Pete. Many of them live in the Baltic states.
Не получается. Мы даже пытались стимулировать общественные организации, чтобы они по своей линии как-то с немцами поговорили. Обращались мы, кстати, и к Европейскому еврейскому конгрессу, обращались и к Израилю, прямо сказав, что, наверное, в интересах Израиля было бы все-таки проявить такую солидарность в отношении
Israel probably should demonstrate solidarity with those who had to survive in the unbearable conditions back then. So we saw no interest in promoting this issue. At the same time, we had found out that there was a blue division compiled of and made up of the Spaniards. It sided with the Wehrmacht in the World War II, and they also participated in the blockade of Leningrad. And the veterans of that blue division still receive payments from the German state, while the blockade survivors, tortured by the invaders, are now in a disadvantaged situation. But the ruling class of Germany is historically oblivious of many things. They have amnesia. While the exposition is dedicated to the Second World War and the joint expositions between the Soviet and German experts are being reconfigured to remove the joint track with the Soviet and Russian participation. Same goes for the memorial complexes and the facilities and the ex-concentration camps and the building where the capitulation was signed by the German Nazi side. So we are now seeing the degradation of the underpinnings of the post-war German society that obtained an identity that was credited worldwide. And now we can see that these instincts come to the fore. RT Deutsch.
Roman Ziskin, RT Deutsch.
Roman Ziskin, RT Deutsch. A follow-up on the previous question. Not long ago, it became known that Germany is a third party in litigation between South Africa and Israel on genocide. The German government made a statement on that. They said, I quote,
историю Германии, преступления против человечности в виде Шоа,
history and
поэтому
crimes
они могут на
against
эту тему высказываться,
humanity.
и поэтому они решительно отвергают и недвусмысленное обвинение в геноциде, вынудили против Израиля в международном суде.
Well,
То есть они
they
выступили
reject
адвокатом Израиля,
the
а не
Shoah
какой-то третьей нейтральной
genocide
стороной.
case.
И
They act
в
as an
целом
advocate
вы
of
сейчас
Israel,
назвали несколько
and
примеров.
you
Вот
called
Дрездену,
you named
табличка, что
several
они пытаются
examples
все
on
больше и больше
Dresden, saying that they
отойти
are
от этого.
trying to step
И
aside from
в
their
связи с этим
commitments.
их
And
критикует
in
уже
this
и Намибия,
respect,
которая была жертвой
Namibia
геноцида в
also
начале 20
criticized
века,
them,
который был
a victim
осужден
of
ООН в
genocide of the 20th century.
1985 году, простите.
And
Советский Союз и
that
его
was
народы при
condemned in
этом тяжелейше испытали на
1985,
себе
and
попытки
the
реализации этого
Soviet
чудовищного немецкого плана
peoples
ОСТ по
were the main victims of the
умертвлению
Ost
или переселению
horrible,
31
horrendous
миллиона человек.
plan to
Сейчас мы видим, как в Берлине все
strip
чаще
of life
оправдывается
or dislodge
нацизм,
31
в
million
принципе.
people. And in
Ваша
Germany
коллега
now
Анна
we
Бербок
can
недавно
see that
сказала, что
Nazism
муж ее бабушки участвовал в
is
защите,
approved
подчеркиваю, в
more
защите
and more often. And
Кёнигсберга. Олаф Шольц
and
считает, что
they
Германия
saying
сейчас
that
стоит на
the
правильной стороне истории. В связи с
ancestors
этим вопрос.
participated in the
Россия
defense of
правопреемница СССР,
Königsberg, and that they are siding.
многонациональные народы России понес самые тяжелые
They're on the
жертвы,
right side
сделал
of the history,
больше
but
всего для того,
Russia
чтобы освободить
has
Европу, в
bore
том числе
the
Германию,
burden and
от
the
фашизма.
brunt
Что в
of
связи с
that
этим
war,
планирует делать Россия
liberating
и
the
что
world
планирует
from the Nazis
противоставлять
and
всем
suffering huge victims? What is
трендам, в том числе и в
the
Германии,
plan of Russia
европейским,
to
в
counter
этом и в следующем
the
году?
trends that make themselves manifest in Germany and in Europe? What are planning for this and next year? This reflects, as I have already said, the degradation of the moral tenets of the Western society that took shape after the Second World War, and they were meant to be guarded. Probably generations changed, and the new generations do not recall the horrors of the Second World War, but that does not strip their government and other governments from responsibility
идеологемам, которые, собственно, легли в основу подготовки
avoid any
Второй мировой войны.
or any
Нас
return
очень
to
расстраивает
those
происходящее в
moral
Германии. Вы
principles of the
и про
pre-Second
то,
World
что
War period. And
Германия
definitely
достаточно
we are
неуклюже
upset by
объяснила свое
these
решение
manifestations and
выступать в качестве стороны
also
разбирательства
by the
в
fact that the
Международном
Germans
суде ООН
offered quite a
по
clumsy
поводу иска
explanation
ЮАР
with
Израиля.
respect to their
Объяснение
position on
действительно странное.
the
Мы
lawsuit
сами были
of South Africa
участниками,
to
организаторами
Israel. That was
геноцида.
quite bizarre. They said we were the
Поэтому будем
organizers of
защищать
genocide
тех,
and we will protect
кто
hence
обвиняется в геноциде.
those who
Я
are
здесь логику
accused of
не
genocide. I
просматриваю,
cannot
правда
see
говоря.
any
И,
straightforward logic in this.
знаете, если говорить про... Я уже сказал, что для нас
Well, I said
принципиальное
already
значение имеет обеспечение безопасности Израиля
that
в контексте
providing for Israel's
полноценного
security means a lot
урегулирования на
for us.
Ближнем Востоке.
It's overarching.
Но
In the context of a full
те
and
стандарты
comprehensive
двойные,
resolution in the
тройные,
Middle East, speaking about double and
когда
triple standards.
Яир Лапид был
When Yair Lapid
премьер-министром
was
Израиля,
Israel's prime minister,
он ничего только не говорил про нашу специальную военную
he said
операцию,
many a
что
thing
это
about our special military
неприемлемо,
operation,
когда
saying it was
неизбирательно
unacceptable
используется
when
вооружение, когда страдают
indiscriminate and
невинные
sweeping
граждане. Это военное
attacks are
преступление.
committed using arms, and he
Несколько
said that
месяцев
it
спустя,
was a
когда
military
уже стало
crime
другое
that
правительство
made
в Израиле, в ответ на
civilians
критику повсеместную за
suffer.
неизбирательное применение тяжелых
And
вооружений,
several months
за
ago, when the government changed their
беспрецедентное количество
responding
жертв,
to the
жертв среди
criticism
гражданских, особенно детей,
over
израильские руководители
sweeping
говорили, ну,
indiscriminate
это
application
трагедия
of
войны.
arms and lots of victims, mortal
В
victims
одном случае
among children and women
специальная
and
военная
other
операция,
civilians.
где близко
They responded it is a
не
war tragedy,
наблюдается такое
nothing more.
количество
You know,
жертв среди
on
гражданского
the one hand, we
населения
have this
за
special
годы.
military operation
Близко не наблюдается, как то,
with the number
сколько
of civil
пострадало
casualties not
гражданских
even
за
close,
3 месяца.
anywhere
В одном
close
случае это военное преступление, в
to the
другом
number
случае
of
трагедия
mortal
войны. Давайте
victims
как-то будем,
of that
наверное,
Gaza
определяться. Есть
conflict. But in
действительно
one
законы
case, it
войны,
is a moral,
которые
it is a war
должны
crime.
уважать, есть
In
международное
the other case,
гуманитарное
it's a
право,
moral
закрепленное
tragedy. You know,
в целом ряде
so we should
конвенций. И
come to terms
российская
about
армия,
that.
проводя
You
специальную
know,
военную
there are
операцию,
some tenets of the
четко следует
international law,
этим правилам и этим
and
нормам.
we have been
Мы
in observance of the
бьем
rules of international
прицельно
law. We
по
have been
объектам
impacting
вооруженных сил Украины
precisely
и связанных с ними
the
инфраструктурных и
military
прочих объектов.
and related infrastructure facilities
Тот
of the
факт, что
Ukrainian army.
в гражданских объектах
The fact that
украинцы размещают свои
the
вооруженные силы,
Ukrainians
в
deploying
жилых
and
кварталах
station
ставят
their
системы
troops in
ПВО, давно
residential
известно.
quarters
Это происходило
is long
на
known,
постоянной основе после начала.
and that
Манеры такие
happened
у них,
constantly
чтобы,
after
если
the
хотите,
start of the
шантажировать
operation. It
мирных
is their
граждан, чтобы
style
сделать из них живой
to
щит,
use civilians as
что
human
категорически
shields,
запрещено
which
международным
is
гуманитарным правом.
absolutely banned by the
Но,
international humanitarian law.
конечно, законы войны необходимо соблюдать. Кстати,
Definitely,
вот я
the laws
упоминал,
of the war must be
что
observed.
советуют
And I
отставные
also
американские
mentioned that
генералы и
the
действующие
retired
британские
American
политики
generals
украинцам
and
как можно
the current British
активнее бить
politicians
по Крыму. Если на линии фронта
advise
ничего не
the
получается, вот
Ukrainians to
давайте
impact Crimea
выводите русских
as
из
hard as
равновесия,
they can once you cannot
сотрите Крым
succeed
с лица земли,
on the
чтобы там жить было
battlefield.
невозможно.
Just try to annoy and irritate
И
Russians,
периодически спрашивают у
erasing
американцев,
the
спрашивали
Crimea from the
тогда,
map with your strikes.
вот как вы относитесь к тому, что
And
вы
Americans
поставляете
were
дальнобойное оружие,
asked
которое используется
about
против
their attitude
гражданских
of
целей?
using the arms
И
supplied by them
Салливан, и
against
Кирби,
civil targets,
который
and both
представляет Совет
Kerbal and
национальной
Sullivan
безопасности, они заявляли, что
from the
украинцы сами
National
решают,
Security Council
по
of
каким
theirs
объектам, по каким
said
целям
that the
наносить
Ukrainians
удары.
made their own decisions
Сами.
about what
То есть,
facilities and
пожалуйста,
targets to
что
impact.
хотите, то и делайте. Они и
So
делают то,
they
что
gave them a
хотят.
free hand, and they
Ими там,
have been
конечно же,
using that
руководят
free
инструкторы, прежде
hand.
всего англосаксонские, мы
Well,
это знаем. А когда
although they
спросили
are guided
того
by
же
the
Салливана
Anglo-Saxon instructors, war
про
instructors,
вот,
when Sullivan was asked
операцию в секторе Газа,
about the Gaza
вы не очень
operation,
там как бы смущаетесь, что вашим оружием проводятся
Does that
операции, в
concern
результате
you
страдают десятки тысяч
and worry
уже
you that
убитых,
your
раненых,
weapons have been
еще больше.
used to cause
Они
tens of
сказали,
thousands of
нет, когда
victims,
мы
and they
поставляем
said,
оружие Израилю,
no
мы
one will supply
оговариваем,
arms
что
to Israel.
его надо использовать в соответствии с законами ведения
We
войны
condition that
и не нанесения
these arms
ущерба
must be
невинным гражданам.
used in accordance with the laws
То
of
есть в
war
нашем случае
and not
таких
damaging
оговорок
the
не
innocent civilians.
делается. То есть
But in
Киев,
our case, they do not
если судить по официальным
have
заявлениям,
these disclaimers or
не
reservations.
выдвигает требования соблюдать
So Kiev
международное гуманитарное право.
is not obliged
Ну,
to
тоже
comply with
подвойные
international
стандарты.
humanitarian law.
Вот,
It is also a matter of
возвращаясь
double
к
standards coming back
Германии
to
и
Germany
к другим
and
странам,
other
где нацизм
countries
начинает
where
поднимать голову. Да, вот вы
Nazism is
упомянули
once again
факт, когда
coming to the fore, raising its head.
надпись на мемориале в
And
Дрездене,
we see the inscription on the memorial
хотя там не
in
было сказано, что
Dresden,
это
even
в память
though
тех, кто
it
пострадал
didn't say
от
that that inscription was to
англо-американских бомбежек.
commemorate
Там вообще
those
США и
who
Англия не
suffered
упомянуты
from
были.
the
Но и
US
то им
and
показалось
British
лишнее,
bombings.
вот чтобы даже
But anyway, even though
косвенно не
it wasn't
напоминать
said so
своим
directly,
новым
they
хозяевам
deemed it
Вашингтону,
necessary
теперь уже Лондону,
not to
о
remind
том, что
their
была
masters,
какая-то вот такая
Washington and
ситуация,
apparently
когда
London now as
англосаксы
well, of the
просто
situation when the
бесчеловечно уничтожали
Anglo-Saxons
город.
simply
Это очень
inhumanely
похоже, между прочим, на
endeavored to
менталитет
destroy the city.
Японии, еще
It is
одной
reminiscent of the mentality
державы
of
оси,
Japan, another Axis
которая
power
против союзников сражалась.
that fought against the
В Японии
Allies.
сейчас в учебниках истории
Today, in
ничего
Japanese
не говорится
history
о том,
books,
кто сбросил бомбы на Хиросиму и
it is
Нагасаки.
not said who exactly
А более того,
dropped
там
the bombs
соответствующая
on
глава
Hiroshima and
школьных
Nagasaki.
учебников,
More
она
than
имеет
that,
такое двойное
that
название.
chapter in
И звучит это
school history
заголовок
textbooks
так. Бомбежка,
is
ядерные
called
бомбардировки
nuclear
Хиросимы и Нагасаки,
bombings of
точка.
Hiroshima and
И без
Nagasaki,
всякого
full stop.
абзаца вступление СССР в войну.
The
Так,
USSR
то
joining
есть
the war.
визуально сразу
So if you look at
детей
that,
подводят к определенным
visually it
выводам.
looks
И в
like
этой же
they're trying
связи,
to push the
когда
children who read
японцы,
these
они
books
периодически
towards certain conclusions.
распространяют проекты
And the
резолюции в
Japanese
Генеральной
sometimes
Ассамблее ООН
circulate draft
с
resolutions in the UN
осуждением,
General Assembly
так сказать, возданием
condemning
памяти жертвам Хиросимы и Нагасаки.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki
И в
attacks
этих
and
резолюциях ни
commemorating
разу не
their
упоминается, что это
victims.
сделали Соединенные Штаты.
And
Просто
not a
вот
single
кто-то
one of
где-то
those
сбросил.
draft resolutions mentions
Помню я
that
и
it was the United States that did it.
когда в Иерусалиме открывался
I also think back
монумент
to
в память блокадников
Jerusalem,
Ленинграда,
where a monument to
и
Leningrad
президент
blockade
Путин там
survivors
участвовал,
was inaugurated
а
with
был
the
Макрон.
participation of President Putin.
А вы знаете,
President
что
Macron also
это было
attended
в день
the inauguration,
памяти
and
жертв
it happened
Холокоста, а
on
этот
the
день
Holocaust
был
Remembrance Day.
назначен
That
на ту
day
дату, когда
also
советские
coincides
войска
with the
освободили
date
Освенцим.
when Soviet
И от американцев
troops
выступал
liberated
Майк
Auschwitz.
Пенс,
And it
бывший,
was
как
Mike
говорится, президент.
Pence, the then
Это
vice
было
president,
потрясающее
was
выступление,
speaking
как
on
они
behalf of the
умеют
United
с
States.
пафосом
The best
на своем
example of
американском
American
языке.
pathos and
Он
rhetorics.
начал выступление свое так, что
A certain
долгие
language, one might
месяцы,
even add.
годы
He said,
людей
throughout many
мучили,
years
убивали, сжигали в
months,
топках
people were
в
tortured
этом страшном
burned
концлагере.
in these
Но
terrifying
вот
concentration camps.
27
But on the 27th
января
of January
1945 года
1945,
пришли солдаты и
soldiers
открыли
came
ворота.
and opened the
Солдаты
gates.
просто, не
Soldiers,
советские.
just soldiers, not
Солдаты. Но
Soviet
когда это говорит
soldiers.
американец,
Well,
многие люди, которые не слишком искушены, будут
many
воспринимать, что
people
конечно,
who
американцы
don't
такие
know
что.
history all that well
Так что эта
could
тенденция
assume that he
существует.
was talking
Как
about
с ней
American
бороться?
soldiers. So the
Только
trend is
правдой,
there.
только
How to fight
инициативно,
it? One might ask.
разъясняя,
Only
идя
using
в
the
народ,
truth,
как говорится,
only
в
by
самых разных
explaining
форумах. Вот
everything, only by engaging the
будет
public.
форум по борьбе
We're
с современными
planning to hold
практиками
a forum on fighting
неоколониализма. Я бы считал,
contemporary
что
practices of
общественность могла бы
neocolonialism, and I think that
подобный форум по
it
борьбе
could
с
be
возрождением
beneficiary to
нацизма
have a
организовать.
similar
Мы готовы в этом
forum
помогать.
about fighting
И
the
это,
revival of
кстати,
Nazism
касается
on the
в
public
решающей
level, and we
степени
are ready to
того,
provide
что
respect,
происходит
relative
вокруг Украины.
assistance,
Вот Максим Григорьев и его
especially as it
соратники
applies to what is going on
показывают
in
сущность
Ukraine.
киевского
Maxim
режима.
Grigoriev
И
and
когда тот
His
же
comrades in
Шольц,
arms are
та же
working
Бербок,
actively.
та
When
же
Schultz,
фон дер
Baerbock,
Ляйен, да и
von der
Макрон,
Leyen, and Macron
ну все они практически говорят, что мы должны
say
Украину поддерживать до
we need
самой
to provide
победы,
assistance
потому что
to Ukraine
Украина
until the
бьется,
victory,
умирает за
because
наши
Ukraine is
европейские
fighting, is
демократические
struggling
ценности.
for our
Совесть есть?
European democratic
Почитайте
values.
законы,
Do
которые
you
были
have any
приняты
conscience at all
по
left?
запрещению русского
Why
языка,
don't you go and
образования,
read
вообще
some
всего русского
laws
и
passed
по
by Ukraine banning the Russian
поощрению
language, everything Russian,
идеологии и практики нацизма.
promoting
Когда там
Nazi
батальоны
ideologies and practices,
свастикой и
glorifying the
с
battalions that
нашивками
fought
дивизии
under
СС
the
маршируют.
swastika
Вот,
signs
поэтому
with
вот такие теперь
Nazi
европейские ценности, если верить
symbols
заявлениям
on their
европейских
uniforms.
политиков. Надо с этим бороться. И
These
по линии официальной
statements made
дипломатии,
by
по линии
European
народной,
politicians are
парламентской дипломатии.
unacceptable, and we
И
need
я очень
to
надеюсь, что по
fight
линии
that using public
журналистского сообщества.
diplomacy as well
У
as
нас тут
the media
итальянские СМИ
community. We have some
представлены.
Italian media
Пожалуйста,
present
давайте
today.
Рая.
Riley.
Caterina Doglio, Italian Broadcasting Company, RAI, Foreign Minister. Let's talk about the elections. You've been in the office for many years. You're very close to President Putin. Do you have a feeling that he's concerned that the special military operation in Ukraine could affect the outcome of the presidential elections? And second point, as you mentioned, in a few days, we will be remembering the war, we will commemorate the Holocaust, the Shoah, and in the exact day the Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz, while many children and elderly are still held captive in Gaza just for being Jews. How is Russia contributing to their liberation, and what is Russia's relationship with Hamas that many in the world consider a terrorist organization?
Насчет специальной военной операции
As for the special military operation and its implications for the election, the special military operation has long
позитивное воздействие на
been
нашу
making a positive
внутреннюю жизнь.
impact on Russia's domestic
Специальная
life.
военная операция
The special military
небывало
operation
сплотила наше общество
has brought
и способствовала
unforeseen
его
cohesion to
очищению
our society
от людей,
and brought about
которые,
a certain
в общем-то,
purification of our society.
не
It
ощущали
helped us
свою
purge it of the
причастность
people
к русской,
who, for one
российской
reason or
истории
another, did not
и
feel
к
an affinity
русской культуре.
with Russia, Russian history, and
Кто-то из
Russian
них
culture.
уехал,
Some of them have left the country,
кто-то из них остался
others
и
have
стал
stayed
задумываться, но
and reconsidered.
подавляющая часть общества
But the overwhelming majority of our
не
society
бывало.
have
Знаете,
been
вот у нас
united,
есть
have rallied around
был
a common
великий
idea.
сатирик Михаил Жванецкий.
You probably remember
Он, к
Mikhail
сожалению, уже не с
Zhvanetsky,
нами.
a great
У него
comedian.
среди прочих гениальных зарисовок,
Unfortunately, he passed a
такая.
while ago, but
это
among
было очень
his
давно,
multiple
лет
sketches,
20, может быть,
he
30
had
назад, когда он
an
это сказал.
absolutely brilliant
У него
one.
был
He wrote it
монолог на
about
тему
20 years ago. It was a
советского,
comic
российского
sketch
народа.
about the Soviet people or the Russian people.
И сказал он
He
следующее.
said the following:
Нашим людям, чтобы по-настоящему сплотиться,
in order to
большая
rally
война
around
нужна.
something, our
Ну,
people
вроде как
need
даже
a
с
big
юмором.
war. He
Но
meant it as
в каждой шутке есть доля правды.
humorous,
И
but there is
то
some truth to
остервенение,
every joke.
с которым Запад объявил нам гибридную войну, то высокомерие, с которым
And the
отбрасывались
ferociousness
долгие
the West
годы
has
все наши
manifested by declaring a war to
предупреждения,
us. Their
предложения о
arrogance
том,
in
чтобы договориться
rejecting
об
our
основах
proposals and
безопасности
suggestions
на
without
основе
agreeing upon the
принципов,
foundations
уже
of security on
одобрявшихся
the
ранее,
basis of the principles
без
that
расширения
were
НАТО. Все это
approved
было отброшено.
beforehand
Не ваше
without
дело.
NATO's expansion. They rejected
Отношения
it
между
all.
Украиной
None of
и
your
НАТО
business,
это
they would say.
не суйтесь.
NATO-Ukraine relations are none of your concern, they would say.
Вот недавно
Don't meddle.
бывший президент Чехии
Recently, former president of the Czech Republic,
Klaus
Klaus,
давал интервью и сказал, что война
gave
началась в
an interview
2008
and
году,
he
когда
said that
НАТО
the war
заявило, что
started
Украина и
in
Грузия будут в НАТО.
2008 when
Putin
NATO
был на этом
declared that
саммите в
Ukraine and
Бухаресте. Я тоже
Georgia
был
would
там.
join
Я прекрасно
NATO.
помню,
Putin was
как
there at that
он
summit in Bucharest.
задавал
I
вопросы
was there too,
той же
and I
Меркель,
remember
французам,
him
зачем вы
asking
это сделали?
Merkel
Ну,
and
там
the French,
американцы с
why did you
англичанами
do that?
попросили.
Well, the
Ну, всё.
Americans and the
И
British
сейчас
asked
американцы с
us.
англичанами
Was the
заказывают
answer.
музыку для Европы.
Right now,
Стыдно.
the Americans are
Континентальной,
calling
так
the shots
называемой
for
Европе.
Europe together with
И
the
всем
British.
этим разговорам
They are setting the tune to which the
ваших
continental
соседей
Europe is dancing.
из Франции, что
Shame on you and your neighbors in France,
Никто вам этой
because the EU
стратегической
has
автономии
to fight for
не
its strategic
предоставит, я вас
autonomy.
заверяю.
No one will give you
Но
this strategic autonomy, let me assure you.
народ небывало сплочен,
However,
и,
our people are
конечно
united
же,
more than ever.
оздоровляющее влияние на общество оказывает то, что происходит вокруг
And
и
what
в
is
ходе
going on
специальной военной
in
операции,
and around the
тот
special military
героизм,
operation has made our
самоотверженность,
society healthier.
самопожертвование,
Have
которое
seen
демонстрируют и бойцы
examples
на
of
передовой,
veritable heroics,
члены их
self-sacrifice
семей,
demonstrated
которые
by the fighters on the front line and the
солидарны
members of their family
со своими
who
родными и с
show
нашей армией,
solidarity
и которые в
with
тылу
their
делают все,
members
чтобы
and
помогать
with our country,
достичь
who do
победы.
everything they can on the
Посмотрите,
home
как
front in
поднялась у
order
нас
to
промышленность, и
bring
не
the
только
victory closer. Just
военная
take a look at
промышленность, и
our
гражданская
industry,
промышленность в
not
условиях
only
санкций.
our defense
То
industry,
есть
but also its
очень много
civilian
факторов,
sectors.
связанных
It has
с
grown quite
агрессией
a lot.
Запада против
Many
России, такой
factors related
гибридной,
to the
всесторонней,
West's hybrid,
сыграли
multifaceted
свою
aggression
роль для того,
against
чтобы мы
Russia
поняли,
have played a certain part
как нам теперь жить дальше.
in
Какие-то иллюзии, если они еще
our
и оставались
decisions on
с
how to
90-х
live
годов, что
on.
Запад теперь
There
нам
had
распахнул
been
свои
some
объятия,
illusions that
демократии нас
existed
всех
in the
объединит.
90s.
Все эти
The West
иллюзии
is going to
улетучились
welcome us
окончательно.
with open arms.
Верить
But now
Западу
these
нельзя.
illusions
Запад
are gone. We
до
can
сих пор
no
хочет
longer
только
trust
одного
the West,
–
because
жить
the
за
West
счет других
wants just one thing,
и
to live
быть
at somebody else's
умнее
expense
всех остальных.
and be smarter
Так ему
than everyone
кажется.
else. At least
Поэтому
that's what they think.
влияние очень позитивное.
It has made a
Второй
very
вопрос
positive
был…
impact. The 27th of January, liberation
Да.
and Gaza. Oh, yes.
Ну, я уже комментировал 27
I have
января,
already commented
и
the
я сказал
27th of
о
January,
том, как Запад
and
пытается
I said that the West was trying
принизить
to
или вообще
diminish
вычеркнуть из истории роль
the role of
Красной Армии в
the Red
освобождении
Army in
Европы,
the
в
liberation of
освобождении евреев,
Europe and
в
the
спасении
Jews, as
тех,
well as
кто выжил после
save
Холокоста.
Holocaust survivors, or even sweep it under the carpet altogether.
Но сектор Газа,
However,
да, мы,
the Gaza
знаете,
Strip, you know,
мы осудили теракт 7
we
октября
have
против
condemned
Израиля
the October the 7th terrorist
мгновенно,
attack
сразу же.
against Israel right
У нас
after the
нет двойных
fact.
стандартов по
We have
отношению
no
к
double
террористам.
standards regarding terrorists,
У Запада есть.
unlike the
Вот,
West.
сейчас Запад активно
Right
использует
now, the
ячейки
West
ИГИЛ
is using
в Сирии
ISIS cells
для того,
in
чтобы
Syria
осуществлять диверсионные акты и атаки на
to conduct
вооруженные
subversive
силы Сирийской
attacks
Арабской Республики.
against the
В
armed
Ливии я
forces
уже
of the
упоминал,
Syrian
когда
Arab Republic.
решили
As for
свергать
Libya,
Каддафи,
when they decided to overthrow Gaddafi,
активно сотрудничали, платили тем самым
they would
группировкам,
cooperate with
которые
and provide
затем
financial assistance
пошли на
to
юг,
the armed
в
groups
Центральную
that
Африку, в
later on
Сахаро-Сахельский
marched
регион и до сих пор
southwards
терроризируют
to the
эти
Sahel,
граждан. Все хорошо знают,
sub-Saharan
что
African countries,
Аль-Каида
and are now
появилась
terrorizing the citizens
после
of those
вторжения
countries.
американцев в
Everyone knows that
Афганистан,
Al-Qaeda
ИГИЛ после
emerged
Ирака,
after the US invasion,
Джабхат
ISIL
ан-Нусра, или
emerged
она
after
называется теперь Хият
the
Тахрир
invasion
аш-Шам, после того,
to
как Запад объявил войну
Iraq.
против
Hayat
Сирии.
Tahrir al-Sham
И Запад
emerged
сотрудничает с этими
after the
объединениями.
West
Это
declared war
хорошо
to
известно.
Syria.
В секторе
Everyone
Газа, да,
knows that the
неприемлемо
West
было
cooperates with terrorist
нападение
groups.
на
As for the
мирных
Gaza Strip,
граждан, на
it was
участников
unacceptable to
фестиваля
attack peaceful
и
civilians,
жуткие кадры.
those people who
Жестокое,
went to that music festival. The footage
гнусное
was
нападение.
terrifying. That
И мы
attack
его сразу осудили, я
was
повторяю еще раз. И
absolutely
мы исходили из
horrendous, and
того,
we
что
condemned it
Израиль,
right
как
away.
как они сами говорят,
Our position
единственная
was
демократия на Ближнем
that
Востоке
Israel, who calls itself the
будет
only
отвечать, как
democracy in the Middle
положено в
East,
теории,
would be
отвечать демократии. Хотя имеет такие
democratic in
примеры,
its
как Соединенные
response.
Штаты, Британия,
Also, although we do have some
трудно
examples, including the US and the UK,
определяться, что
that
же
make it difficult
из
to
средств
understand
ведения войны
what means of war
допустимо для демократии.
are acceptable for
Но,
democracies.
понимаете, я сейчас очень откровенно скажу,
I'm going to be
у
very
израильтян
frank and forward
вот в
now.
тех заявлениях, которые делали министр
In the statements
обороны,
made by the Israeli Minister
командующий
of Defense, the
армией,
commander
ряд
of the
других
army,
министров,
and a number of other officials,
там же
including
даже
ministers,
звучало, что палестинцы это не люди, это
they
животные.
called Palestinians animals
Примерно
rather than
как
people.
Яценюк говорил,
More or
что
less
на
like
Донбассе
Mr.
живут
Yatsenyuk
не люди.
would say
Как
that
Зеленский
it is
говорил, что это не
non-humans
люди, а
who live
существа.
in the Donbass, just like
Как всякие
Zelensky
там
said
Ермаки, Кулебы,
that the people living in
Подоляки
the Donbass are creatures,
заявляли, что
just like
Русню
Yermak,
нужно
Kuleba,
физически
and
истреблять.
Podolyak would say that
Это
the Rusnya,
жуткая
a
аналогия.
derogative term for
Но
Russians,
прозвучало
were
ведь
to
там,
be
что
exterminated.
палестинцы тоже... Я понимаю, что в этом правительстве есть
And I know that in that government there are
ультраэкстремисты, и они
ultra-extremists,
не выражают
and
позицию
perhaps
не
they do
только
not speak
израильского народа, но и даже
for
всего
the Israeli
правительства
people,
Беньямина Нетаньяху.
or probably
Но
for
это
the entire
звучало, и это
government.
нигде на Западе, в демократиях в этих,
But not a single
не
Western
встретило какого-либо
democracy
отторжения. Как не
responded
встретило
to that,
отторжение и то, что да, они
to
там,
those remarks.
там нет мирных. В Газе
There were also
все,
remarks
начиная с
that
3 лет,
there
уже
are no
экстремисты.
peaceful civilians in
Это тоже
Gaza.
звучало. И тоже
Everyone
никто не реагировал.
over 3
И когда
years old
мы
are
сказали,
already
что надо
extremists.
пресечь насилие
No
и
response from the
создать,
West
наконец,
either. And
палестинское
when we said
государство,
that it was time to put an end to
когда
violence and create
Гутерреш,
a
генеральный секретарь
Palestinian
ООН,
state, when
осудив
Guterres,
теракты
the
7
UN
октября,
Secretary
сказал,
General,
но они
condemned
произошли
the
не в
October the
вакууме.
7th attacks
Почитайте, что
and
ему
said that
сказал
they did not,
посол
they
Израиля
happened for a
при
reason.
Организации
Just
Объединенных
read
Наций,
what the
что ООН
Israeli
и
envoy to the
Генсек — это
UN
вообще
responded
пособники
to that.
терроризма,
He
что
called the
Генсека
UN
пора
and the
увольнять.
NSG
Почитайте.
accomplices to terrorists, and it was time to fire
Действительно,
the
молодежь,
UNSG. Just read
дети
that.
в Газе,
Young
они
people and
рождаются в
children
условиях,
in
когда
Gaza are
более
born
70 лет
in a situation where
обещанное
the
Генеральной Ассамблеей ООН палестинское государство
Palestinian
не
state
только не
promised to
создано,
them by the
но
UNGA over 70 years
шансы
ago
на его
has
создание
not been
становятся все
created
более
yet. And the chances
зыбкими
that
и
one day
мизерными.
it will be created are becoming more and
Потому что
more
такую
elusive,
политику вот поощряют
smaller and
Соединенные
smaller,
Штаты, монополизировавшие
because this
инициативы
policy was encouraged by the United
на
States
Ближнем
that has
Востоке. И вот
monopolized
Блинкен опять
initiatives in the
удалось
Middle East.
подтвердил,
In
что
Davos,
они
Blinken
будут
once again
оставаться
reaffirmed that they would
главными, и что
stay
этого хочет якобы
the
весь
main
регион.
player there, that
Но
the entire region wanted that.
я помню, с министрами иностранных дел Израиля, с Виктором
I
Либерманом, в
remember
частности, у нас
Savigdor Lieberman,
было немало
former
таких бесед,
Israeli
откровенно,
Minister of
просто
Foreign Affairs.
человеческих,
We had quite a
насчет
few frank
палестинского
discussions
государства.
about the Palestinian state.
Ципи Ливни тоже, когда она руководила МИДом. И я говорил, что по
Tzipy
нашей
Livni,
оценке
also a foreign minister of Israel.
отсутствие прогресса в создании палестинского государства
And I
является
said that
единственным
the
наиболее
absence
значимым
of
фактором,
progress in the creation of the
подпитывающим
Palestinian state was the most
экстремизм
substantial factor
на арабской улице.
feeding extremism in the
Ну,
Arab
они
streets.
выражали скептицизм. Нет,
They
ну
were
что ты
skeptical about
упрощаешь,
that. You
это гораздо
oversimplify, they
глубже,
would say. It's
это
much deeper
вот
than that, they would say.
фундаментализм
It's
исламский.
Islamic fundamentalism.
Но жизнь доказывает как раз
However,
обратное,
life is
что
proving
чем
to be
дольше
otherwise.
будет сохраняться полный тупик
The longer
в создании палестинского
the
государства,
creation of the Palestinian state is in an
сложнее
impasse,
будет
the harder it will
обеспечивать
be to
безопасность
ensure security
и Израиля, и других
for
арабских стран, как мы
Israel
можем это
and
наблюдать.
other Arab states,
И
something we
то,
are
что
witnessing
сейчас
today.
и
Right now, Biden, Blinken, and the Europeans are talking about the need to start making progress towards the creation of the Palestinian state. Well, they understand. They know that without that it will be very difficult to defuse the situation. However, starting is not enough. We need to make sure that the Israelis and Palestinians sit at the same table and start talking. We cannot allow the Americans to speak about this matter with someone in hushed whispers behind closed doors. They are trying to include Arabs in the discussions that exclude Palestinians. Right now, the United States are trying to make all the decisions in their stead, for these decisions to suit their own interests. It is a manifestation of the same neocolonial practices.
So you see,
израильтянам нельзя даже создавать впечатление, что поскольку они страдали во Второй мировой, им все можно сегодня.
Try to create impression that
Да, был Холокост, это жуткое
because of their sufferings during the Second World War, they can do whatever they want right now. Yes, Holocaust was terrible, just as the genocide of all peoples of the Soviet Union was horrendous. Those peoples suffered as much. They were destroyed and killed in the concentration camps and during the siege of Leningrad, because in that case then we would be allowed to do whatever we want as well. No, such a system won't do if we want to preserve international law. Getting back to Ukraine, I listed the reprehensible laws that ran afoul of all European values, Russophobic, neo-Nazi, racist laws that have not elicited a word from Europe. Europe only says that Ukraine in waging a war against Russia is protecting European values. Europe has not commented. Oh, no, yes, they did give some comment on the National Minorities Act, but only with a single purpose, namely removing any restrictions on the use of EU languages, which would mean that only the Russian language would be completely and totally discriminated against. In particular, I spoke to colleagues whose countries' languages are represented in Ukraine, and they fought for those languages. They wanted to get exemptions for those languages in the national minorities law, and they promised to help, but not a single thing happened because they don't give two straws about the Russian language. Maybe they want the Russian language to be discriminated against. They want a narrower space for the use of the Russian language in Ukraine. Europeans are like that. And why? You know, Kyiv is allowed to do anything, and this all permissiveness is manifesting itself in every field. Yes, sometimes Americans are trying to address some reproaches to them, but they're doing that behind closed doors. You know, when the process, when the issue was broached that a start should be given to negotiations with Ukraine on the accession to EU, even though Serbia and Turkey have been waiting for years and dozens of years, but Ukraine is jumping the queue. And Ukraine can even torture and kill an American citizen in prison. And the Americans are keeping mum about that. Well, look, usually the U.S. is doing everything to help their citizens should they find themselves in prison, but in this particular case they didn't do a thing. But all permissiveness leads to a catastrophe, and a catastrophe has already struck the brains of the current Ukrainian leadership, and that is where all of them are leading to them. Since Italian media are concerned with neo-fascism, I do hope they will make videos and footage about marches of neo-fascists in Rome. So far, we haven't seen anything like that. Right now, союзные речи, please. Thank you, Minister, Madam Spokesperson. You were saying that Madam Spokesperson is distinguished, but you didn't call me distinguished minister. Well, everyone is distinguished. During the Cold War, the Soviet diplomacy addressed many difficult issues. Right now, there is a new spiral of the Cold War. NATO exercises are as large scale as they haven't been for quite some time. So my question is, how are Russia and Belarus going to contain NATO aggression? What are the diplomats going to do? Are there any realistic ways of minimizing this threat through diplomacy? Well, God forbid this happens. But should the suicidal logic prevail in the West, I can assure you that the peoples of Russia and Belarus standing side by side will do everything to protect their independence and sovereignty. We do not have any doubts as to that. We've got every means necessary to achieve these goals. Now, as far as diplomacy is concerned, I spoke about that when I broached the subject of strategic stability talks between Russia and the US. So far, I do not see any space for diplomacy. When they address us, we respond. But depending on what they propose, we look whether that fits our interests or it doesn't. Let me cite an example. One of the big European countries, not an English-speaking country, invited our ambassador to their foreign ministry. And they started to say, yes, of course, our relations are at a low point, almost non-existent, and there's little chance they grow better, but you've managed to strengthen your positions in Africa, in Central African Republic, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Chad, whereas our positions have grown weaker. So let's meet together and let's have a look into what we can do. And I'm not joking, so cynicism is soaring as high as it can. So publicly we are enemies, but they want our aid for Africa. They want us to help them bolster up their positions there, but this won't happen. The same goes for Americans. I quoted, they said, let's talk about the START treaty, how we're going to conduct inspections on a neutral basis. We understand that all the other avenues are at a very low point, but okay, let other things rest. We will continue criticizing one another, but as far as the inspection of your nuclear facilities goes, we want to talk about that. I always thought that diplomatic institutions are where smart people work, but it's not always the case. So I anticipated your question, so I brought some documents that we got from our counterparts from the European Union. They've got kind of an instruction how to communicate with Russian diplomats. Each capital that has a mission of the EU and a Russian embassy, this leaflet has been distributed in each and every capital like that. European Diplomats should avoid bilateral contacts with Russian representatives. Attending any events organized by the Russian side is prohibited, and the same goes for receptions on Diplomats' Day, the 23rd of February, 9th of May. Mind that, speaking, so they cannot celebrate the victory in the Second World War, and also the Russian National Day on the 12th of June. Moreover, Russian diplomats should not be invited to events organized by the European Union or by the EU members. Attending events organized by third countries that are going to be attended by Russian diplomats is possible. Thank God. Now, as for joint photos, well, they can be taken, but contacts should be avoided with Russia, and the host country should be told that efforts should be made to make sure that the Russian delegation and the European delegation should not be placed together at common photos. So this is to illustrate what we think, what is our assessment of the possibility of talks. A great deal of attention is being paid to photos. That's true. The main testimony to the success of the meeting, Davos meeting on Ukraine, currently is the fact that more people are seen on the photo taken at the event. The Industry of Eurasia Journal. Good afternoon. Industry of Eurasia magazine. Minister, there is a question we broach every year. What's the impact of European sanctions on the development of the Eurasian Economic Union? That's the first question. Secondly, there is the Union state of Russia and Belarus. Last year, President of Kazakhstan was making inquiries whether Kazakhstan could be admitted into the Union state, and what was required to achieve that. The President of Belarus was not against. So are there any ideas of establishing a Union state that would include not just Russia and Belarus, but also other countries of the former USSR? Thank you. As for the measures adopted by the Eurasian Economic Union amid the current conditions, to be honest, I do not think I should make a detailed list of all the measures that are often discussed at the meetings organized by the President and by the Prime Minister. No effort is spared to make sure that the key industries for our security should be completely independent of those who've proven completely untrustworthy as partners, those who've proven that they can betray you at any point in time in economy, just as they can betray you in politics or in life in general. As for the Union state, truly it's a flagship of the Eurasian Economic Union. In many aspects, it's setting the tone as well as the path for further development of the Eurasian Economic Union. But to be blunt, I haven't heard any interest of Kazakhstan in joining the Union state. Thank you, Madam Spokesperson. Once again, Merry Christmas. and Happy New Year. Minister Lavrov, I've got two questions. First, what do you think about Argentina's refusal to join BRICS? And my second question goes as follows. How is it possible to reinforce ties with Latin America this year? And how is it going, not just with Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, but also other countries of Latin America? You spoke about the parliamentary conference that took here in Moscow, but does it mean that a new format of relations with Latin America can be inaugurated? As for Argentina's statement, it's a sovereign decision by a country that has been invited to join BRICS. The invitation was extended under the previous leadership, under the previous president, and when the invitation was sent out, the previous president said that the new president after the elections would make the final decision, and the decision has been made. So it's not a complete refusal. They've provided explanations why they're currently not ready for that. We took it in stride. We hope that once the new government of President Milei has found their way around and established themselves more firmly, they will make a final decision. But be that as it may, BRICS's popularity is growing, and as mentioned previously, we've got almost 30 bids and applications aimed at establishing some kind of ties with BRICS. Currently, we will concentrate our efforts on smoothly integrating the newcomers so as we could continue our path forward henceforth. In general, we've got very good relations with the Latin American states, with most of them. We're not trying to condition these ties on whether a leftist government or a right government is in power. We're working with everyone who wants to work with us on a reciprocal basis, on a mutual basis, who wants to benefit from such cooperation, and the majority of countries are like that. And last year I've been to the countries you mentioned, but I've also gone to Brazil, and I'm going to Brazil once again because late in February Brazil is going to host a foreign ministerial meeting of the G20, and tied to that is our visit to a number of other countries. We've also established contacts between Russia and CELAC. That's the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. There was a tradition of holding annual ministerials between Russia and the 3 or 4 countries of CELAC. Unfortunately, this tradition was upset by the COVID pandemic, but we intend to resume this practice henceforth. But I agree with you that the format Latin America, Russia, is fully worthy of further exploration, not just in the parliamentary dimension, but also under the executive authorities, and we're working on that. American media. Yes, please, over to you. Minister Lavrov, do you think there are going to be changes in Washington's policy with regard to Russia after the presidential elections in the US? Thank you. Well, you shouldn't address this question to me. This question should be addressed to those who are going to be elected by the American people. Well, with the understanding that it's going to be a fair election. Thank you. Serbia, please. Good afternoon. My name is Jago Shine, Politica Serbia. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Madam Zakharova, because I've come here today, and, you know, our newspaper is celebrating a very big anniversary, 120 years, and you're celebrating your anniversary in your capacity as foreign minister. So I would like to ask you about Serbia. What's the future of Kosovo? What are the prospects? And what's going to happen in the West Balkans in future? What are the prospects for that? And another question. 6 weeks ago, you visited Skopje and you were snubbed by Blinken and other Western foreign ministers, but you were ready to talk to them for the sake of peace and in order to avoid escalation. So I've listened to you. You say that you were willing and ready to talk, and you've spoken to some of your counterparts. And we've got a proposal from our newspaper in Belgrade. We want you to come to Belgrade and to meet with Secretary Blinken. We need to make sure you come together and start a dialogue between you two.
Thank you very much.
Насчет Косово, и президент Путин, и ваш покорный слуга, всегда, когда мы встречаемся с руководством Сербии, говорим, что мы поддерживаем и поддержим ту позицию, которую выберет сербский народ, сербское руководство. Мы видим, как над сербами издеваются. Если брать косовскую проблему, в 2013 году при посредничестве Европейского Союза было достигнута договоренность между Приштиной и Белградом о создании сообщества сербских муниципалитетов в Косово. Там все было расписано, какие у них права, как они организуют свою жизнь, обеспечивают правоохранительные функции, язык, образование, школы, церкви. Прошло уже больше 10 лет, ничто не изменилось, и тупик выполнения этой договоренности, которую Евросоюз преподносил как свое величайшее дипломатическое достижение, тянется уже долго. И Евросоюз ничего сделать не может. Единственное, что они сейчас смогли, как я понимаю, сделать, это они придумали Евросоюз в угоду господину Курти, в угоду Приштине. Они сейчас переписывают эту договоренность о сообществе сербских муниципалитетов Косово, переписывают таким образом, чтобы не было никаких прав у сербов на севере Косово, чтобы эти права были абсолютно какими-то искусственными, а реальная власть должна оставаться у албанцев.
should stay with the Albanians, and this is something shameful for the EU.
Били в Литавры в 2013 году, что вот мы добились, вот все проблема Косово решена. Ничего подобного. И сейчас точно так же, как по любому другому вопросу, когда надо выполнять договоренности, они отрабатывают назад в пользу той стороны, которая им ближе в данном конкретном случае. А ближе, конечно же, косовские албанцы, потому что они поклялись в верности, они хотят и в НАТО вступать, они везде хотят вступать. И будут верно следовать указаниям Евросоюза, если только потом не взорвется албанская проблема на Балканах. Я, кстати, до сих пор не знаю, почему используют термин «Западные Балканы». Что Запад? Албанский фактор, он очень серьезный. Вы упомянули Македонию.
And the Albanian factor is very serious. You have mentioned
Македонии сидит за столом, на котором водружен албанский флаг.
Still their speaker seats at a table with the Albanian banner next to him. Although there is a Macedonian flag somewhere farther on. As regards Skopje and the OSCE ministerial, I do not know whether they ignored or snubbed me, or probably they bolted away. Before I arrived, they had gone, they had left. I do not see any issues in communicating like a year and a half ago during the G20 event and summit in Indonesia. I represented our president upon his behest, and in the course of the meeting, Secretary Blinken, by his aid, offered to walk out and communicate, and we had a standing talk for 10 minutes, and they tried to preach us that we should bring Ukraine to an end, the Ukrainian operation to an end. We heard nothing new. When conflicts are
Ничего нового по сравнению с публичными заявлениями наших западных коллег никогда не звучит. Но насчет интервью у вас на вашей площадке, не знаю, я не вижу большого смысла, честно. Оно не будет интересно. Оно будет из лозунгов состоять, зная выступление Тони. Серьезный разговор должен вестись на публике. Они к этому не готовы абсолютно. Не готовы во всех смыслах. Ни политически, ни содержательно.
From the perspective of substance, and the final question will be asked by a naval officer in the uniform. Thank you very much. Marina Vladimirovna, thank you, Mr. Minister. I represent Marxism, ideological center and think tank. We can hear you loud, okay. So it is about dialectics. And Mr. Dostoevsky said that the being manifests itself only when it faces a threat of non-being, and the Caribbean crisis of 1962 may serve as an example. Our submarine was equipped with bombs, and the commander prepared a nuclear torpedo to strike American warships.
Только случай ему не позволил это сделать. Случай. Only в этой связи, как вы думаете, Сергей Юрьевич, тот факт, что Запад отклонил наше предложение по безопасности от 15 декабря 2021 года, не катится ли вся наша вот эта ситуация к повторению Карибского кризиса в варианте 2.0?
Многократно в последнее время обсуждается на разных ток-шоу, политологических сборах, и аналогично одна из наиболее ярких наши ведущие ученые-международники высказываются на эту тему, трактаты пишут, как нам дальше быть с тем, чтобы не допустить скатывания к ядерной войне, а для этого нужно, чтобы с той стороны хоть какой-то элементарный страх вернулся, потому что сейчас якобы у них никакого страха нет. Я вижу здесь несколько игроков. Если бы на Западе те, кто отвечает за политику, каждый мог бы высказываться самостоятельно, я думаю, ситуация была бы другой. Но они все построены. Их построили американцы, но и в очень большой степени британцы. Я приводил примеры, когда Лондон буквально наускивает Зеленского бомбить любые объекты на любой части Российской Федерации. Приводил примеры, когда, пусть они бывшие, но это военные американские, которые возглавляли американские вооруженные силы в Европе, Ходжес и
I mean, the ex-commanders Hodges and
второй какой-то,
the
не
other,
помню уже.
I forget his
Когда
name.
они говорят, надо в
He
Крыму
also said that
уничтожить все
the
возможности
Crimea
для жизни, чтобы там
should be
флота
made
российского не было, и никого нет. Это они вот прям
uninhabitable,
на днях
so that
сказали.
no fleet should be stationed
Залезть
there,
в голову
no
к этим
navy.
людям было бы интересно. Я просто хотел посмотреть,
You know,
они
entering their mind,
провокаторы или они
and
думают,
sifting
что у
through their
нас
mind would be
коленки
interesting.
дрогнут.
Are they provocators
Вот,
or rebel
и
rousers,
никто
or
их
do they
никто их
just
не
think that
одергивает.
we will
Все только и говорят, что Путин
be
угрожает
scared out
ядерной
of
бомбой,
our
хотя
guts
ни разу
and
такого
wits?
не было произнесено, в отличие
Everyone
от
keeps saying that Putin
европейцев,
has
от американцев.
brandishing a
Те же
nuclear
немцы
bomb, but
говорили,
that was
Путин должен
never the
знать, что у
case,
нас,
and
у
the
НАТО
Germans
тоже есть
keep
ядерное
saying that
оружие. Многократно
Putin must
англичане,
know that
бывшая
NATO
премьерша, которая
also
говорила, наш муж,
has
не
nuclear
колебаясь на
weapons, and the
кнопочку.
former
Но
UK's Prime Minister said that she will
нас не надо
press the
пугать.
button without
Это
hesitation,
вот
but you should not spook us.
многие это знают.
Many people know that.
Надо Черчилля читать почаще,
Just
у него
read
есть афоризм.
Churchill every now and
Насчет
then.
русского медведя, как с ним надо обходиться.
He had some thoughts
Спасибо
about
большое,
Russian ban, how to treat
График.
it. I apologize, colleagues, but I have a tight schedule, so we conclude that. Thank you.